It was a pesticide meant to kill insects, until the Nazis turned it into the deadliest weapon of the Holocaust. Zyklon was never designed as a weapon of mass death. It was born as a pesticide, a chemical created to cleanse ships and warehouses of rats, lice, and insects. A colorless, deadly vapor, it was efficient, effective, and invisible, the kind of innovation that seemed destined only for commerce and sanitation. Yet, in the twisted hands of a regime obsessed with purity, control, and extermination, this ordinary compound became something monstrous. It would be remembered not as a tool of progress, but as one of the most infamous instruments of murder the world has ever known. To understand Zyklon B is to peel back the layers of the Holocaust itself, for here lies the intersection of science and ideology, technology and cruelty, bureaucracy and genocide. It was not forged on the battlefield in the heat of combat, but through boardroom contracts, industrial supply chains, and cold calculations scribbled on paper. Ordinary businessmen signed the orders. Scientists and chemists adapted its use. SS officers requisitioned shipments, and at the end of this chain, in sealed concrete chambers disguised as showers, tens of thousands of lives at a time were extinguished within minutes. Death came not with the roar of artillery, but with silence, coughing, and collapse. When British and American soldiers liberated the camps, they expected to find prisoners, perhaps weapons, perhaps prisons. What they discovered instead was a system, vast, organized, and methodical. With Zyklon B at its dark core, they found empty tins, the faint bitter smell of cyanide still clinging to the walls, and survivors who spoke of friends and family herded into rooms, never to return. These accounts revealed a horrifying truth. Genocide had been industrialized, reduced to a chemical process. Human life, once sacred, was measured in efficiency, tonnage, and delivery schedules. The story of Zyklon B is not only about the chemical itself, it is about the companies that manufactured it, the officials who approved it, the guards who used it, and the silence of so many who knew but did not speak. It is about how modernity, with its science, its progress, its efficiency, can be twisted into something unrecognizable, a weapon not of the future, but of annihilation. And it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Genocide does not emerge from chaos alone. It requires structure, supply chains, and human decisions at every step of the process. Tonight we uncover the entire history of Zyklon B, from its invention and industrial roots, to its adoption by the Nazi regime, to the way it became synonymous with Auschwitz, Majdanek, and other names that echo with suffering. We will follow the paper trail, the shipments, the testimonies of survivors, and the trials of those who stood in court, claiming they were merely following orders, merely doing business, merely supplying a product. In the details of Zyklon B lies the chilling reminder of how ordinary tools and ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil. So settle in, as we open this chapter of history that is as vital as it is haunting. This is the entire story of Zyklon B, the chemical that began as pest control and ended as a weapon of genocide. And before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are? Because across oceans and generations we remember together to ensure such silence never falls again. At the dawn of the 20th century, the world of science was being transformed by chemistry, a field that promised breakthroughs in medicine, agriculture, and industry. Laboratories across Europe were discovering new compounds that could control pests, preserve food, and protect human settlements from disease. Among these innovations were cyanide-based fumigation chemicals designed to kill insects that spread plague or infest grain supplies. Cyanide had long been known for its lethal properties, but in small controlled applications it was considered a powerful tool of progress. German chemists, driven by the nation's ambition to lead in scientific research, studied how to stabilize cyanide gas so it could be released in a predictable and safe manner. This was not yet the world of weapons or mass destruction. It was a world of science for agriculture and hygiene. The compound they pursued was not originally envisioned for harming people, but for saving crops and protecting public health. It was part of a broader scientific effort to modernize societies emerging from the Industrial Revolution. Laboratories were filled with optimism, believing that science could solve hunger and improve life for millions. Yet behind the white coats and chemical formulas, the seeds of something darker were being sown. The story of Zyklon began with research into hydrocyanic acid, a volatile liquid that evaporates into a deadly gas. German chemists sought to harness its insecticidal power while reducing the risks of accidental poisoning for humans handling it. Hydrocyanic acid had been used in fumigation for decades, but it was unstable and difficult to control. Scientists in the early 1900s developed methods to bind the gas to inert materials, creating pellets that could safely store the chemical until released. This innovation meant cyanide could now be deployed in warehouses, ships, and agricultural silos with greater precision. The Weimar Republic inherited these developments after the First World War, as Germany sought to rebuild its industrial base. Agricultural recovery was a national priority, and chemical pest control became an essential part of modernization. The pursuit of such compounds was not unusual in a world where typhus and crop failure could devastate entire populations. To German scientists, this was a triumph of applied chemistry. To history, however, it was the first step toward transforming a pesticide into an instrument of death. The Degesch company, short for Deutsche Gesellschaft für Schädlingsbekämpfung, or German Corporation for Pest Control, emerged as the primary innovator in this field. Founded in 1919, Degesch specialized in pest control chemicals and quickly became a hub for cyanide-based research. Its scientists developed a formulation where hydrocyanic acid was absorbed into carriers like diatomaceous earth, stabilized with a warning agent to signal danger. This stabilized form would later be marketed as Zyklon, a product designed for fumigation and pest eradication. At first it was lauded as a revolutionary advance, safer and more efficient than previous fumigants. Degesch worked closely with Germany's agricultural industries, promoting Zyklon as a modern solution to age-old problems of vermin and insects. Warehouses, silos, and ships transporting goods were prime customers for the chemical. The company's innovations fit into Germany's broader post-war vision of technological rebuilding. Yet in its laboratories, a substance was being perfected whose future would stain history with unspeakable crimes. The scientific principle behind Zyklon was deceptively simple: trap a deadly gas in a solid medium, and release it when exposed to air. Cyanide worked by halting cellular respiration, preventing the body's cells from using oxygen, and leading to rapid suffocation at a microscopic level. In insects, this meant swift extermination without the need for sprays or manual fumigation. To chemists, the efficiency of cyanide gas was a marvel of modern science. Zyklon pellets could be shipped, stored, and used without immediate danger until activated. Once opened, the pellets slowly released their poisonous vapors into enclosed spaces, ensuring complete fumigation. Farmers and shipping companies saw it as an indispensable tool to preserve goods from rot and infestation. What made it revolutionary was its controlled stability. It was lethal, but it could be handled by trained personnel without constant risk. This balance between death-dealing power and safe storage became the defining feature of Zyklon, and it was this very efficiency that would later attract the interest of the Nazi regime. In the Weimar era of the 1920s, Zyklon was introduced as a commercial product, marketed under the name Zyklon A, before later refinements produced Zyklon B. Its early uses were entirely industrial, aimed at combating lice, beetles, and rats in warehouses and ships. German port cities became frequent users, as imported goods risked infestation and contamination. Train cars and storage facilities were fumigated, protecting both commerce and public health. Farmers across the country adopted Zyklon to safeguard grain reserves, ensuring food security during uncertain economic times. German scientists presented Zyklon as a symbol of modernization, a chemical solution to timeless agricultural problems. The product even won a reputation abroad, with some foreign companies studying its potential applications. At this stage, Zyklon was not regarded as controversial. It was a celebrated innovation in the battle against pests. Few could imagine that the same canisters designed to protect food would later be deployed in chambers to destroy human lives. But history's tragedies often begin in places where no one suspects. The development of Zyklon cannot be understood without recognizing the broader German fascination with chemical science in the early 20th century. Germany had led the world in chemistry since the late 1800s, producing Nobel laureates and pioneering new compounds. Chemical giants like BASF, Bayer, and Hoechst were already global names, and their laboratories were seen as engines of progress. Degesch, though smaller, drew upon this national culture of innovation, embodying the marriage of science and industry. At universities, students studied the toxicology of gases, exploring how minute quantities could kill pests without contaminating food. It was part of a rational technical mindset that viewed chemicals as tools to solve human problems. Few scientists considered the moral implications of working with substances known for their lethal potential. To them it was chemistry in service of society, an exercise in control over nature. But the line between pest and person could in the wrong hands be fatally blurred. The knowledge that brought safety to food supplies would eventually be corrupted into a weapon of genocide. When Zyklon B was officially introduced in the late 1920s, it came with safety features designed to prevent accidents. A warning agent, often described as a strong-smelling irritant, was added so that handlers could detect its release. This was vital in preventing accidental deaths among fumigation teams, since hydrocyanic acid itself was odorless in its pure form. Instructions detailed precise procedures, how to seal a warehouse, how long to wait, and how to ventilate afterward. These measures reflected the scientific rigor behind the product, emphasizing that Zyklon was dangerous but manageable. For commercial users, these precautions were evidence of professionalism and responsibility. However, when the Nazis later repurposed Zyklon B for mass killing, the warning agent was deliberately removed, stripping the chemical of its safeguard. This chilling alteration transformed it from a pesticide into a silent killer, unseen and undetected until too late. In this act, science was twisted into a tool of cruelty. It was the first signal of how far Zyklon would be bent away from its original intent. The birth of Zyklon was thus not a tale of conspiracy, but of scientific innovation entwined with industrial ambition. Its invention reflected a world still haunted by hunger, disease, and economic instability, where chemical solutions promised security. At its core, Zyklon was designed to protect human life by safeguarding food supplies and eliminating pests. Yet history would give it a darker destiny, as political ideology and inhuman policies seized upon its properties. What began as a tool of hygiene would become synonymous with mass death. In the laboratories of Degesch, no scientist envisioned the role their creation would play in genocide. They saw formulas and fumigation schedules, not gas chambers and human suffering. But the chemical itself held no morality. It was a substance waiting to be used by those in power. When the Nazi state rose in the 1930s, it found in Zyklon a weapon ready at hand. The story of Zyklon's birth was over, but the story of its transformation had only just begun. The story of Zyklon B cannot be separated from the history of its manufacturer, the German Corporation for Pest Control, better known as Degesch. Founded in 1919 in Frankfurt am Main, Degesch emerged during a turbulent time in German history, just after the collapse of the German Empire and the devastation of World War I. Germany's food supply had been strained to the breaking point during the war, with shortages leading to hunger, malnutrition, and outbreaks of pest-borne disease. The nation's agricultural and industrial sectors urgently needed modern solutions to prevent such crises from happening again. Degesch was created as a specialized company devoted to chemical pest control, a field that promised both profit and national importance. Its early mandate was not political, but practical: find scientific ways to eliminate insects, rodents, and other carriers of disease that endangered human survival. In an era before antibiotics and widespread refrigeration, pest control was considered a matter of national security. The founding of Degesch, therefore, represented a fusion of science, industry, and post-war recovery. Few could predict that within 2 decades its products would become infamous worldwide. From its inception, Degesch operated at the intersection of industrial chemistry and public health. The company's scientists worked with hydrocyanic acid, long known for its toxicity, to develop a stable, controllable fumigant. Their innovation was to combine cyanide with absorbent carriers, transforming it into a product that could be safely handled until activated. Early formulations were tested in warehouses, ships, and grain silos, environments where infestations threatened large-scale economic loss. The company promoted its products as essential to protecting Germany's agricultural productivity, which had been crippled by the war and subsequent blockades. Degesch's first major commercial product was Zyklon A, a fumigant that included irritants to warn users of its presence. Over time, refinements led to the more efficient and widely used Zyklon B. In brochures and scientific journals, Degesch presented Zyklon as a hallmark of German chemical ingenuity. For farmers and industrial clients, it seemed to represent progress and modernity. But beneath this veneer of practicality lay the dangerous truth: the company's most profitable creation was also one of the deadliest substances on Earth. Degesch did not exist in isolation, but was part of a powerful network of German chemical companies. Its majority shareholders included giants like IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate that dominated European industry. IG Farben itself was a titan of the era, a merger of BASF, Bayer, Hoechst, and other firms, responsible for everything from synthetic fuels to pharmaceuticals. With IG Farben's backing, Degesch had both financial stability and access to cutting-edge research. This industrial support allowed the company to expand its operations, refine its products, and secure contracts across Germany and abroad. Zyklon B became one of its core offerings, advertised as a reliable solution for hygiene and food protection. Within a few years, it was widely distributed in ports, rail networks, and military facilities, where pest control was considered essential. The scale of its distribution highlighted the reach of Germany's chemical industrial complex. What might have remained a niche fumigant was now a nationally recognized brand. This network of corporations created the infrastructure that would later enable Zyklon's repurposing on a horrifying scale. The original uses of Zyklon B were entirely non-human, targeting lice, beetles, and rodents. Ships carrying goods across oceans used it to fumigate cargo holds before docking in foreign ports. Farmers deployed it to protect grain silos from infestation, preserving food supplies for the hungry population. Warehouses and military barracks employed it as a defense against typhus, which was spread by lice and remained a serious threat in post-war Europe. The chemical's effectiveness was unmatched. It could penetrate small spaces, suffocate pests quickly, and leave behind no residue harmful to stored goods. Clients appreciated its efficiency, and its reputation grew rapidly. German authorities even endorsed its use in railway cars to ensure hygiene in the expanding national network. By the late 1920s, Zyklon B was a standard tool in Germany's fight against infestation. In these applications, it was still seen as an instrument of progress. Its association with mass murder had not yet begun, but its capabilities were already being normalized. Degesch's operations were run like any modern industrial firm, with laboratories for research, factories for production, and sales divisions for marketing. Engineers worked to refine the pellets and improve their stability, ensuring they could be transported safely across long distances. Safety instructions accompanied each shipment, warning of the need for ventilation and the presence of a strong-smelling irritant. Marketing emphasized that Zyklon was scientific, modern, and indispensable for protecting valuable resources. The company courted agricultural associations, municipal governments, and industrial clients, with promotional materials that showcased efficiency. Degesch has even conducted demonstrations to prove Zyklon's effectiveness against infestations that had plagued communities for centuries. These efforts paid off, and the company prospered in the 1920s and early 1930s, despite Germany's economic turmoil. For many Germans, Zyklon B became synonymous with cleanliness and modern hygiene. The irony is that the same characteristics that made it appealing, efficiency, safety and storage, and lethal precision, would also make it ideal for the darkest of purposes. In this sense, Degesch is unwittingly perfecting a product for future atrocities. The company's leadership was composed of experienced industrialists and chemists, most of whom regarded their work as purely technical. They saw themselves as part of Germany's proud chemical tradition, heirs to Nobel laureates and pioneers of modern science. To them, Zyklon was a triumph of applied chemistry, an innovation that addressed practical needs in a difficult era. They wrote detailed reports on production yields, fumigation schedules, and chemical stability, with little reflection on the broader implications of their work. The culture within Degesch was one of scientific rationality, where chemicals were evaluated only by their effectiveness. Moral questions about the potential misuse of such substances rarely entered the discussion. This detachment between science and ethics was common in industrial laboratories of the time. What mattered was progress, profit, and prestige. The chemists of Degesch likely believed they were advancing civilization, not creating tools of genocide. Yet history would later reveal how dangerous such detachment could be when exploited by a regime without moral boundaries. As Germany slid deeper into political upheaval during the late 1920s and early 1930s, Degesch continued to thrive, shielded by its industrial connections. Its ties to IG Farben ensured both capital and influence, linking it to some of the most powerful economic forces in the country. When the Nazis rose to power in 1933, they quickly recognized the importance of industrial chemistry for their ambitions. Although Degesch itself was not founded as a political instrument, it soon became enmeshed in a system where industry and dictatorship converged. Contracts with the government expanded, and Zyklon B was increasingly used by state agencies for fumigation in camps, railways, and border stations. Official endorsements boosted its reputation, solidifying its place as a trusted product of German science. Within Degesch, the transition appeared seamless. The company simply continued producing what it always had. But the context around its products was shifting dramatically. What had been a tool of hygiene was slowly being absorbed into a machinery of repression. This marked the beginning of Zyklon's sinister transformation. By the eve of World War II, Degesch stood as a symbol of the intertwining of science, industry, and state power in Germany. Its scientists had created a chemical marvel, its executives had marketed it successfully, and its industrial backers had ensured its wide distribution. At this stage, Zyklon B was still promoted as a pesticide, not a weapon, but its lethal capacity was well understood. The infrastructure for its mass production and delivery was already in place, awaiting only a new application. In boardrooms and laboratories, decisions continue to be made in technical terms: output quotas, efficiency rates, and safety measures. But outside those walls, the Nazi regime was preparing to expand its persecution of Jews and other targeted groups. When the moment came, Zyklon B was ready, not because Degesch intended it for genocide, but because it had been designed to be lethal, efficient, and scalable. The company had built the perfect tool for extermination, even if it had not foreseen its ultimate use. In this way, Degesch's story became inseparable from one of history's greatest crimes. In the years between World War I and World War II, Zyklon B occupied a very different space in the public imagination than it would later. It was known not as a weapon, but as a modern chemical marvel designed to combat pests that threatened health, trade, and agriculture. Germany, still reeling from the devastation of the Great War and the crippling effects of the Treaty of Versailles, desperately sought to rebuild its infrastructure and food supply. Pest infestations were not minor inconveniences, but national crises that endangered livelihoods and survival. Lice spread typhus, fleas carried plague, and rats destroyed stored grain. Zyklon B, with its cyanide-based potency, offered an effective solution at a time when few alternatives existed. It could penetrate hidden crevices and fumigate entire facilities in a matter of hours. For municipal authorities, farmers, and shipping companies, this was nothing short of revolutionary. To them, Zyklon B represented science serving humanity's most urgent needs. The chemical's lethal potential was overshadowed by its practical effectiveness. Shipping industries across Europe and beyond quickly became some of the earliest adopters of Zyklon B. Cargo ships, arriving in German ports, carried infestations that could devastate both food and textile supplies. Degesch marketed Zyklon B as the answer, emphasizing its ability to eliminate rats, beetles, and lice in cramped maritime environments. Crews would seal ship holds, release the pellets, and wait for the invisible gas to do its work. Within hours, pests were eradicated, and the ship could safely unload its goods. This process safeguarded not only the cargo, but also the dock workers and surrounding communities, who otherwise risked exposure to dangerous outbreaks. Port authorities embraced Zyklon B as a preventive measure, turning fumigation into a routine requirement for international trade. The chemical thus became synonymous with efficiency in global commerce. Maritime journals praised its reliability, and soon its use extended far beyond German shores. In this context, Zyklon B was not controversial but celebrated. Warehouses and storage facilities were another key market where Zyklon B thrived during the interwar period. Grain silos, often infested with weevils, moths, and rodents, were particularly vulnerable to massive economic losses. Traditional methods of pest control, such as traps and powders, were inadequate for large-scale operations. Zyklon B changed the equation by offering total fumigation in sealed environments, killing pests in bulk rather than one by one. The chemical's strength lay in its invisibility and penetration, reaching corners that human cleaners could not. Farmers and storage managers reported significant reductions in spoilage, preserving vital resources in a time when hunger still loomed over post-war Europe. Government agencies encouraged its use as part of national campaigns for food security. Agricultural publications began describing Zyklon B as indispensable for protecting modern food systems. For many in rural communities, its adoption seemed like a step into the future. Few paused to consider what such lethal efficiency might mean if turned against people. Public health authorities also found Zyklon B attractive for controlling insect-borne diseases. Typhus, which had killed millions during and after World War I, remained a persistent threat in Europe's overcrowded cities and refugee camps. Lice were the carriers, and traditional methods of eradication had proven ineffective. Zyklon B provided a chemical answer that seemed both scientific and humane, sparing communities from epidemic outbreaks. Entire barracks, schools, and detention centers were fumigated with the substance to remove lice infestations. Officials praised the gas as a tool of hygiene, a way to protect civilians from diseases that had devastated armies and populations alike. Medical authorities, unaware of its future infamy, promoted Zyklon as part of routine public sanitation. Its branding as a hygienic protector strengthened its reputation as a positive innovation. In this way, Zyklon B entered daily life not as an object of fear, but as a silent guardian of health. It was an industrial poison rebranded as modern progress. Internationally, Zyklon B found customers far beyond Germany's borders. Agricultural exporters in Eastern Europe adopted it for protecting grain shipments headed to Western markets. French warehouses, Italian ports, and Scandinavian farms also incorporated the chemical into their pest control arsenals. In Latin America and Asia, importers of European goods received shipments already fumigated with Zyklon, ensuring pests did not spread overseas. The product's reputation became global, aided by Degesch's aggressive marketing and the prestige of German science. Trade manuals listed it alongside other trusted chemical innovations, elevating it to an international standard. For shipping companies and governments alike, the decision to use Zyklon was rarely questioned. It was simply the best tool available. This widespread normalization ensured that its presence in warehouses, docks, and silos seemed unremarkable. Its adoption across continents reflected a world eager to embrace chemistry as the solution to practical challenges. Few outside the chemical industry understood how dangerous such normalization could become. Advertising played a crucial role in shaping the positive image of Zyklon B during the interwar years. Degesch created brochures that portrayed the product as scientific, modern, and essential for safeguarding communities. Posters depicted clean granaries, pest-free ships, and farmers proudly guarding their harvests. Scientific journals carried articles that described Zyklon's efficacy in clinical terms, lending it the aura of objective truth. The company downplayed the lethal risks, presenting it instead as a tightly controlled tool in the hands of professionals. Even the name Zyklon, derived from the German word for cyclone, evoked power and cleansing rather than death. Farmers and officials alike came to associate the brand with reliability, not danger. By emphasizing its hygienic role, Degesch successfully separated the product's chemical violence from its marketed identity. This carefully crafted image concealed the potential for catastrophic misuse. It was an image that would later shatter in the most horrifying way imaginable. At this stage, Zyklon B's identity was firmly rooted in the promise of modern science improving daily life. It was celebrated as a practical tool in the industrialized world's arsenal against pests and disease. Journalists praised it as part of Germany's chemical renaissance, proof that German science could deliver solutions to pressing problems. Farmers saw it as a shield against famine, port authorities as a safeguard of trade, and doctors as a protector of public health. The chemical's lethal properties were reframed as virtues when directed at insects and rodents. To the average user, it was not a poison to fear, but a disinfectant to trust. This mindset reinforced the idea that science was neutral, a matter of technique rather than morality. In the interwar years, Zyklon B was not yet a symbol of terror, but a symbol of progress. It was a product that fit seamlessly into the optimism of an industrializing world. Its darker potential remained unseen by most of those who handled it. By the late 1930s, Zyklon B had established itself as a staple of global pest control and sanitation. It was woven into the fabric of agriculture, shipping, and public health, with thousands of tons in circulation each year. The infrastructure for mass production was in place, and its distribution networks extended across continents. In this normalized context, the gas seemed almost banal, no different from fertilizer or disinfectant. Yet its very normalization would later enable its repurposing for genocide without hesitation or resistance. When the Nazis sought a chemical solution for mass killing, they turned to what was already available in abundance. The world had unknowingly prepared the tools of its own nightmare. What had once been advertised as progress would soon become synonymous with death. Zyklon B's interwar story is thus one of scientific achievement, industrial integration, and dangerous blindness. It was a poison hiding in plain sight. When Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party seized power in 1933, their vision of Germany demanded the mobilization of every sector of society. Industry, once focused on commerce and science, was now enlisted to serve ideology and war. Companies that had thrived during the interwar years suddenly found themselves bound to a government that demanded loyalty and production for the Reich. For the chemical sector, this meant not only supplying fertilizers and fuels, but also producing the materials that could shape Hitler's racial policies. The Nazi worldview was obsessed with purity, biological, cultural, and national, and it looked to science to enforce these ideals. German chemistry, with its global reputation, became a willing tool in this process. Firms that once sold disinfectants to farmers began supplying the SS with substances rebranded as instruments of hygiene. This blurring of lines between sanitation and racial ideology marked a turning point. Zyklon B, once a mundane fumigant, became increasingly tied to a system of power that would soon weaponize it. The partnership between state and science was not accidental but intentional, orchestrated by the Nazis' demand for total control. Central to this transformation was the Reich's alliance with industrial giants like IG Farben, Degesch, and its subsidiary, Degesch. These corporations provided the technical expertise, factories, and distribution systems that could scale up chemical production to unprecedented levels. IG Farben, already one of the largest chemical conglomerates in the world, became entwined with Nazi ambitions from the earliest days of the regime. Executives attended rallies, donated funds, and aligned their corporate strategies with the goals of rearmament and conquest. Degesch, the company that produced Zyklon B, was smaller but strategically positioned in the realm of pest control and sanitation. Its leadership saw opportunity in aligning with state contracts, which promised profitability even as Europe slipped into authoritarian darkness. The Nazi government rewarded loyalty with lucrative supply agreements and access to captive labor. As bureaucrats and scientists collaborated, industrial chemistry became inseparable from political repression. Zyklon B's role shifted from a commodity of agriculture to a regulated asset of the Reich. Industry and ideology were no longer separate forces, they were partners in a shared project of domination. The Nazis framed this alliance under the banner of hygiene, a word that carried scientific legitimacy while disguising genocidal intent. Public campaigns warned of disease, parasites, and contamination, drawing parallels between vermin and targeted human populations. Posters compared Jews, Roma, and others deemed undesirable to lice or rats that threatened the body of the nation. By couching their racial policies in medical language, the regime transformed hatred into something that appeared rational, even scientific. Chemistry provided the tools, while ideology supplied the narrative. Zyklon B, already trusted as a disinfectant, became an ideal symbol of this fusion. Its very marketing emphasized cleanliness and protection, which dovetailed perfectly with Nazi propaganda about racial purity. The gas could be sold to the public as a weapon against disease, while quietly being redirected toward human beings. This manipulation of science served as one of the most effective deceptions of the era. The line between killing pests and killing people grew dangerously thin under the regime's control. The SS, tasked with enforcing racial policies, quickly recognized the potential of industrial chemicals as instruments of repression. Concentration camps, initially created to imprison political opponents, expanded rapidly after 1933 to include Jews, Roma, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and deliberate neglect created conditions ripe for disease. Authorities used fumigation with Zyklon B to delouse prisoners, reinforcing the dehumanizing narrative that equated them with vermin. Wooden barracks were sealed, clothing was stripped, and Zyklon pellets were dropped into chambers to kill lice. At first, these fumigations targeted objects, not people. But the psychological association was powerful. Entire populations were treated as if they required chemical cleansing. Guards spoke of prisoners in terms borrowed directly from pest control. This normalization of poison in the camp environment was a crucial step in preparing both the perpetrators and the infrastructure for mass killing. What began as sanitation was already pointing toward annihilation. The shift from pest control to human extermination was only a matter of ideological decision. Behind the scenes, Degesch and its executives were aware of their growing importance to the Reich. Orders for Zyklon B increased dramatically, driven by SS contracts that far exceeded civilian needs. Although officially the gas was for fumigation, company officials could not ignore where their product was being shipped. Concentration camps like Auschwitz, Majdanek, and later Bergen-Belsen became major destinations. Each delivery required coordination with camp authorities, who demanded larger and more frequent shipments. Profits surged, and the company's balance sheets reflected the scale of this transformation. Shareholders benefited as the product that once saved crops now sustained a machinery of repression. The economic incentives blurred any ethical hesitation. In the Nazi state, survival of a corporation often meant complicity with state crimes. Zyklon B's distribution became a mirror of Germany's descent into organized barbarity. Science had been captured by ideology, and industry was rewarded for its compliance. This process did not happen in isolation. It was part of a larger Nazi strategy to mobilize every aspect of society for the war of race and conquest. Universities produced racial science that justified extermination, while industries provided the means to carry it out. Chemistry was only one piece of this puzzle, but it was a decisive one. Gas was efficient, invisible, and impersonal, making it an attractive method of control. While Zyklon B had not yet been formally adopted for mass executions, The infrastructure and mental framework were firmly in place. Engineers designed sealed chambers under the guise of delousing facilities. Camp authorities grew accustomed to ordering chemical shipments in bulk. Civilians who once trusted Zyklon to protect them from pests could not imagine its lethal repurposing. This was the genius of the regime's deception. It weaponized the ordinary until it became extraordinary in its horror. The foundation for genocide was built with the tools of everyday science. Meanwhile, Nazi propaganda worked tirelessly to justify this growing partnership between ideology and industry. Newspapers portrayed the fight against pests and disease as a patriotic duty, reinforcing the logic of chemical cleansing. Speeches by Nazi leaders used metaphors of infection, pollution, and contagion to describe targeted groups. The language of medicine became the language of genocide. Zyklon B, framed as a tool of health, was quietly linked to the task of racial purification. Industrial executives, many of them trained scientists, understood the implications but rarely resisted. Instead, they adjusted to the regime's demands, rationalizing their compliance as economic necessity. The chemical's dual identity, as both protector and destroyer, was fully entrenched by the late 1930s. Industry's loyalty to profit made it an ally of ideology's loyalty to hatred. Together, they created a synergy that would define the darkest chapters of the Holocaust. The stage was set for Zyklon B's transformation into the ultimate instrument of death. By the eve of World War II, the partnership between Nazi power and German chemical industry was unbreakable. Zyklon B stood at the intersection of commerce, science, and ideology, ready to be redefined. To the public, it remained a disinfectant, a hygienic measure against lice and rats. To the SS, it was already a tool for controlling prisoner populations and reinforcing dehumanization. And to its producers, it was a profitable product tied to the fate of the Reich. Each of these perspectives converged to conceal the horror that lay ahead. The gas was normalized, accepted, and distributed in vast quantities across occupied Europe. It symbolized the seamless way in which ideology could capture science and bend it toward destruction. What had once been a chemical of progress was poised to become a chemical of genocide. The fusion of industry and ideology ensured that when the moment came, Zyklon B would be ready to serve. Long before Zyklon B became the emblem of mechanized mass murder, the Nazis experimented with other methods of killing. In the early years of the regime, executions were often carried out through shootings which were brutal, messy, and psychologically damaging to the perpetrators. The SS and police units tasked with mass shootings in occupied territories struggled with the emotional toll, as even hardened men faltered when ordered to kill women and children at close range. This practical difficulty led Nazi leaders to search for more efficient and less personally taxing methods. The idea of mechanized death was not born in a single moment, but emerged from a series of grim improvisations. One of the earliest methods tested was the use of carbon monoxide gas, an invisible killer that left behind few outward signs of violence. It was first applied in the so-called euthanasia programs, which targeted disabled Germans deemed unfit to live. These programs provided the regime with both a blueprint and a training ground for larger operations. In these grim laboratories of killing, Nazi officials learned how to mask murder as medicine. What began in asylums and hospitals would soon expand into the concentration camps. The T4 euthanasia program, launched officially in 1939, represented the first state-organized system of industrialized killing. It targeted those considered life unworthy of life, including the mentally ill, the physically disabled, and individuals judged socially unproductive. Doctors, who should have been guardians of life, signed certificates condemning patients to death, under the guise of mercy. Families were deceived with false death notices and fabricated causes such as pneumonia or heart failure. In specially converted facilities like Hadamar, Brandenburg, and Grafeneck, victims were brought into sealed rooms disguised as showers. There, carbon monoxide from bottled cylinders was piped in, suffocating them within minutes. Medical staff observed, recorded, and refined the process, treating human beings as subjects in an experiment. Crematoria burned the bodies, eliminating evidence while normalizing industrial disposal of the dead. These programs desensitized a generation of personnel who would later staff the extermination camps. The lessons of T4 became the foundation upon which larger systems of genocide were built. Carbon monoxide gas soon extended beyond the euthanasia centers into the broader machinery of Nazi repression. In the occupied East, Einsatzgruppen units tasked with mass shootings looked for alternatives that spared the shooters from direct confrontation. Gas vans emerged as one such solution, first tested in 1940 and later deployed widely. These were sealed trucks into which victims were forced, unaware of their fate. Once the doors were locked, exhaust fumes were rerouted back inside, filling the compartment with lethal carbon monoxide. Within minutes, the prisoners collapsed, asphyxiated in total darkness. The vans were presented as a more humane method for the perpetrators, if not for the victims. Operators did not have to watch their targets die, and corpses could be transported directly to mass graves. Yet even this system revealed logistical problems, mechanical failures, delays in killing, and the sheer horror of unloading piles of bodies. Still, the principle was clear. Gas offered a means of death that distanced executioners from their victims. The technique was brutal in its simplicity, paving the way for more sophisticated killing facilities. In the early concentration camps such as Dachau and Sachsenhausen, experimentation with different killing methods reflected the regime's trial and error approach to systematic murder. Prisoners were shot, hanged, beaten to death, or starved, each method revealing the regime's indifference to human suffering. But these camps also became sites for medical and chemical experiments designed to find scalable ways of extermination. Doctors tested poisons on prisoners, recording dosages, reactions, and survival times with clinical detachment. Cyanide compounds, including early variants of fumigation chemicals, were occasionally administered in small-scale trials. The transition from medical murder to industrial murder was already underway. Guards and doctors learned how to conceal killings, falsify records, and dispose of bodies in ways that minimized outside scrutiny. Camp commandants reported these practices to higher authorities, who analyzed their efficiency and cost. Killing was increasingly framed as a problem of logistics, not morality. Dachau and Sachsenhausen thus became laboratories of death, preparing the ground for what would later be perfected at Auschwitz. The use of carbon monoxide in the euthanasia centers proved deceptively effective, but it also raised practical challenges for large-scale deployment. Bottled gas had to be transported, stored, and carefully handled, creating supply chain vulnerabilities during wartime. Cylinders were heavy, and their transport to remote locations in occupied territories was logistically demanding. Moreover, the reliance on medical infrastructure risked exposing the killings to public knowledge, as staff and families noticed the disappearance of thousands. Even in a dictatorship, rumors spread quickly, and opposition from churches and some conservative figures pressured Hitler to halt the public face of T4 in 1941. But while the program was officially suspended, it continued in secret, and its personnel were quietly reassigned to the East. Doctors, administrators, and technicians trained in T4 brought their expertise to new projects in occupied Poland. These men were instrumental in designing and operating the first extermination camps. In this way, the euthanasia program became both a precursor and a recruitment pool for the Holocaust. What began as domestic policy now became continental in scale. When Nazi planners turned their gaze toward the final solution, they carried with them the technical lessons of these earlier killings. The goal was not simply to kill, but to do so efficiently, in secrecy, and on a mass scale. Shooting entire populations proved too slow and psychologically corrosive for the killers. Gas fans, while effective in small numbers, could not handle the vast populations the regime intended to annihilate. Carbon monoxide from engines and cylinders offered temporary answers but raised sustainability concerns. What the Nazis sought was a method that could be industrialized, hidden under the cover of bureaucratic routine, and executed with minimal strain on personnel. The early camps and euthanasia centers had demonstrated that gas could fulfill this role. Engineers began exploring sealed rooms, ventilation systems, and chemicals that were cheap, transportable, and lethal. Each experiment brought the regime closer to the grim solution it was searching for. The stage was set for the adaptation of Zyklon B. For the perpetrators, the transition from shooting to gassing represented not just technical progress, but also psychological relief. Mass shootings had left officers shaken, with reports of nervous breakdowns among SS men forced to execute civilians. By contrast, gassing allowed killers to step back from direct confrontation. They no longer had to look their victims in the eye or feel the recoil of their weapons. Instead, they became operators, pressing switches, sealing doors, or releasing gas pellets. The act of murder was depersonalized, hidden behind walls and mechanisms. This shift lowered the moral barrier for many perpetrators, making mass killing more sustainable on a psychological level. It also allowed the regime to recruit broader participation, as fewer men objected to indirect killing. The transformation of murder into a bureaucratic task was a hallmark of Nazi innovation. With each experiment, genocide became not only possible, but bureaucratically manageable. The early trials were the training ground for this horrifying efficiency. By the time the Nazis perfected Zyklon B as their chosen weapon, the groundwork had already been laid through years of experimentation. The shootings, the gas vans, and the euthanasia centers were not isolated horrors, but steps in an evolutionary process of killing. Each method revealed the regime's willingness to adapt, refine, and escalate in pursuit of its genocidal goals. The early camps became places where ideology met technology, where hatred was translated into process. Carbon monoxide taught them that invisible gases could kill quickly and efficiently. The euthanasia program demonstrated how to disguise mass murder as medical necessity. Gas vans proved that mobile methods could reach dispersed populations. All of these elements converged into the system that would culminate in Auschwitz, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Majdanek. Zyklon B was not an accident of history, but the outcome of deliberate experimentation. The early Nazi camps were thus the rehearsal for the Holocaust, where methods were tested, personnel were trained, and killing became industrialized. From these dark beginnings, the machinery of genocide would emerge fully formed. In the autumn of 1941, a sinister transformation occurred at Auschwitz that would mark the beginning of Zyklon B's use as an instrument of mass murder. Originally designed as a pesticide, Zyklon B had been used to disinfect barracks, fumigate clothing, and combat typhus outbreaks that spread rapidly in overcrowded camps. Its presence within Auschwitz was therefore unremarkable at first, seen as part of routine hygiene measures. But within the corridors of the SS command, there was growing interest in whether this chemical could serve a far darker purpose. The commandant, Rudolf Höss, and camp doctors like Karl Fritsch began to consider alternatives to shootings and carbon monoxide, which were proving inadequate for the escalating demands of genocide. The opportunity arose in September 1941, when Soviet prisoners of war were delivered to the camp in large numbers. Weakened, starved, and marked for death, they became the test subjects for this new killing method. The SS sealed a group of these prisoners in the basement of Block 11, a prison within the camp notorious for torture. Buckets containing Zyklon pellets were poured onto the stone floor. What followed was the first mass killing by Zyklon B in history. The prisoners locked inside the basement of Block 11 experienced an incomprehensible terror as the Zyklon pellets released their invisible poison. Unlike carbon monoxide, which filled gas chambers gradually, hydrogen cyanide gas spread quickly once released from the carrier crystals. Victims gasped for breath, clawed at the walls, and collapsed in convulsions as the oxygen in their blood was blocked at the cellular level. The SS, observing from outside, recorded the effectiveness of the substance with cold detachment. Within minutes, the room was filled with silence, broken only by the muffled sounds of the dying. When the doors were opened, the sight shocked even hardened SS officers. Dozens of bodies piled upon one another in grotesque positions of struggle. The efficiency of the method was undeniable. Unlike shootings, there were no gunshots, no mess of blood, and no emotional toll for the executioners. The experiment confirmed what the Nazis had been searching for: a scalable, cleaner way to kill. Zyklon B, once a tool against lice, had now crossed the threshold into genocide. This initial experiment was not an isolated event, but the beginning of a systematic refinement. Encouraged by its effectiveness, Karl Fritsch repeated the test on larger groups of Soviet prisoners. Each time the SS adjusted the amount of pellets used, the size of the space, and the sealing of the chambers to maximize efficiency. Prisoners were herded into cellars, doors barred, and Zyklon introduced from openings above or through vents. The officers carefully recorded how long it took for victims to die, how quickly the gas dispersed, and how easily the room could be ventilated afterward. In these grisly rehearsals, murder was reduced to a technical problem awaiting solutions. Lessons learned in Block 11 were applied to other buildings, including the camp morgue. Soon Auschwitz had its first semi-permanent gas chamber in the repurposed crematorium at Auschwitz. The transition from experiment to operation was seamless. The groundwork for industrial killing had been laid. For the SS leadership, the use of Zyklon B represented not only technical progress, but ideological triumph. Here was a substance that turned extermination into a process that could be executed with bureaucratic precision. No longer did guards have to fire bullets into individuals or endure the trauma of face-to-face killing. Instead, entire groups could be annihilated in silence behind sealed doors. The gas did the work, allowing the perpetrators to walk away and return later to collect the corpses. This detachment was crucial, as it enabled the killing machine to function without breaking the morale of its operators. Within the Nazi worldview, Zyklon B became a symbol of modernity harnessed for ideological goals. It transformed genocide into something resembling industrial production, with raw material, human beings, processed into corpses in a matter of minutes. The method's success at Auschwitz ensured that it would spread to other camps. By the end of 1941, the fate of millions had been sealed. The transition of Zyklon B from pest control to mass murder was shrouded in secrecy, but not without careful planning. Supplies of the chemical were ordered under the pretext of fumigation, ensuring no suspicion from outside suppliers. Degesch, the company producing Zyklon B, continued to believe, or claimed to believe, that the product was being used for hygiene. At Auschwitz, however, The SS modified delivery methods to adapt to their murderous needs. Openings were created in ceilings or walls to allow guards to pour the pellets from above, minimizing their own risk of exposure. Ventilation systems were studied to clear the chambers quickly, so the next group could be brought in. Doctors stood by to declare victims dead, their medical knowledge twisted into instruments of bureaucracy. Step by step, Zyklon B was integrated into camp routines, its dual life as disinfectant and execution tool carefully concealed. To the outside world, it was still a pesticide. Inside the camp, it had become the centerpiece of extermination. What distinguished Zyklon B from previous methods was its capacity for scale. Shootings were limited by the endurance of the shooters. Gas vans could kill dozens at a time, but required transportation and frequent cleaning. Carbon monoxide cylinders depended on a steady supply chain that was vulnerable in wartime. Zyklon B, by contrast, was compact, transportable, and devastatingly effective. A few kilograms could kill thousands of people, stored safely until use. Its crystalline form meant it was stable in transit, yet lethal once exposed to air. Unlike bullets or fuel, it required no elaborate logistics beyond discrete shipments. The Nazis quickly recognized its potential as a solution to their self-imposed challenge of annihilating entire populations. At Auschwitz, the experiments demonstrated precisely what the regime had been seeking. The chemistry of mass murder had found its weapon of choice. As Zyklon B proved itself in the killing basements of Auschwitz, the SS began expanding its application to other prisoner groups. No longer restricted to Soviet POWs, the victims now included Jews, Poles, and Roma, swept into the machinery of death. Each killing was a rehearsal for the mass exterminations to come. The corpses were examined for signs of how the gas affected different body types and ages, further turning murder into experimentation. The medical officers noted that children and the elderly died fastest, while stronger adults convulsed longer. Such observations were not written with compassion but with cold scientific interest. The Nazis were not merely killing, they were perfecting a system. These early months of Zyklon B use were marked by an obsession with efficiency, with every killing treated as data for the next. Out of this process grew the confidence to expand the practice into purpose-built gas chambers. The small-scale experiments became a model for genocide. By the end of 1941, the first experiments with Zyklon B had forever altered the trajectory of Auschwitz and of the Holocaust itself. What began in the basement of Block 11 with Soviet prisoners was now recognized as a breakthrough in the Nazi search for mechanized killing. The SS leadership in Berlin received reports confirming the gas's effectiveness, and plans were set in motion for permanent installations. Within a year, the provisional chambers at Auschwitz would be replaced by purpose-built facilities capable of murdering thousands per day. Zyklon B, born from pest control, had been repurposed into the most infamous killing agent in history. The shift was not accidental but deliberate, the outcome of cold calculations that valued efficiency above humanity. From this point forward, the Holocaust entered its most mechanized and systematic phase. The chemical designed to protect life from disease became the means to extinguish life itself. In the silence of sealed chambers, genocide had found its most terrible tool. Zyklon B was deceptively simple in its construction, a crystalline carrier material infused with hydrogen cyanide, stabilized with irritants and warning agents. When sealed inside airtight containers, the pellets appeared harmless, inert to the touch and easily stored, but once exposed to air, especially in warm and enclosed spaces, the crystals released hydrogen cyanide gas, one of the deadliest poisons known to man. The Nazis recognized this volatility not as a flaw but as an advantage. Unlike conventional explosives or weapons, Zyklon B did not require firepower, electricity, or heavy machinery to deliver death. It needed only a confined space, bodies to inhale the gas, and time for the poison to do its work. Its delayed release, minutes rather than seconds, gave perpetrators the ability to disperse it safely before sealing doors shut. For those inside, the room became a trap without escape. The chemistry of death had been weaponized into a tool of genocide. To understand how Zyklon B killed is to confront the cruel efficiency of biochemistry turned against human life. Hydrogen cyanide gas, once inhaled, passed through the lungs into the bloodstream almost immediately. There it bound to an enzyme known as cytochrome C oxidase, an essential player in cellular respiration. By attaching itself to this enzyme, cyanide effectively prevented the cells from using oxygen, even when it was abundant in the blood. Victims suffocated at the cellular level, starved of oxygen despite gasping for air. Within minutes, organs began to fail, and the brain succumbed to unconsciousness. The process was agonizing, marked by dizziness, spasms, and violent convulsions. The stronger the victim, the longer the struggle lasted, while children and the elderly often collapsed within moments. Death was not instantaneous but drawn out, a physiological betrayal as life systems shut down piece by piece. The Nazis chose Zyklon B because it combined efficiency with availability, cloaking murder in the disguise of sanitation. Unlike carbon monoxide, which required continuous gas supplies, Zyklon B could be stored for months and used in precisely measured doses. Its earlier association with fumigation allowed the SS to justify large orders without raising suspicion from suppliers. The fact that it left no visible marks on the body made it especially useful in their eyes. Corpses retrieved from gas chambers bore only the contorted signs of suffocation, blue lips, arched limbs, frozen expressions of terror, but no obvious wounds. This absence of gore was seen as a logistical improvement over mass shootings, which left bloodied fields and traumatized soldiers. Zyklon B transformed killing into a sterile process, at least for those administering it. The victims remained hidden behind sealed walls, their cries muffled, their struggles unseen. For the perpetrators, genocide became a matter of routine procedure. The mechanics of the gas chamber itself were designed to maximize Zyklon B's effectiveness. Prisoners were herded into sealed rooms disguised as showers, with false faucets and tiled walls to maintain the illusion. Once the doors closed, guards above or outside opened vents and dropped pellets into wire mesh columns or perforated shafts. The warmth of human bodies and the enclosed air accelerated the release of the poison. Within minutes, the chamber filled with an invisible cloud of cyanide gas, heavier than air, sinking to the floor where children suffocated first. Prisoners clawed their way upward in desperation, climbing over one another to reach the last pockets of breathable air. In less than 20 minutes, the chamber fell silent. Ventilation fans were then activated to clear the space. For the SS, it was not a place of death, it was a machine for processing. For the prisoners, it was the end of all hope. The selection of Zyklon B was also driven by its logistical simplicity in the broader machinery of the Holocaust. Railcars arrived daily, unloading thousands of victims into Auschwitz and other extermination centers. To kill such numbers with bullets would have required unimaginable amounts of ammunition, weapons, and manpower. Gas vans, tested earlier, were mobile but too limited in capacity. Carbon monoxide chambers proved useful but lacked scalability and efficiency. Zyklon B solved all these problems at once. It was cheap, transportable, and adaptable to large groups. A single canister, weighing less than a few kilograms, could kill hundreds of people in one use. The Nazis, ever obsessed with statistics, calculated the cost per death and found Zyklon B grotesquely economical. In their bureaucratic mindset, the choice was obvious. Science had provided them the perfect tool for industrial murder. For those who survived or witnessed the aftermath, the horror of Zyklon B killings defied comprehension. Corpses were often discovered in tangled heaps, the strong crushed beneath the desperate weight of others who had climbed in their final moments. Many bodies bore signs of clawing, nails broken against concrete walls, or embedded in flesh from frantic grasping. Some victims had their children in their arms, still clutching them when the gas took hold. The silence afterward was haunting, a room filled not with screams but with the absolute stillness of extermination. Sonderkommando prisoners, forced to remove bodies, recalled the stench of bitter almonds, the telltale smell of cyanide lingering in the air. Their task was mechanical: drag the corpses out, strip them of clothing, extract gold teeth, and prepare the chamber for the next transport. The cycle was efficient and relentless, designed to function without pause. In this silence, human dignity was extinguished alongside life. From the perspective of Nazi ideology, Zyklon B was not only a tool, but a symbol of control. It reduced entire groups of people, families, communities, cultures to inert bodies in a matter of minutes. The efficiency fed the illusion that extermination was rational, clinical, even necessary. It aligned with the Nazis' obsession with order, transforming genocide into a bureaucratic routine, stripped of the chaos of open violence. But beneath the machinery, the reality remained profoundly human. Each victim was an individual, each death a universe of memory extinguished. Survivors later described how the gas chambers represented the ultimate betrayal of modern science. A substance born from the drive to protect health had been twisted into an instrument of unimaginable cruelty. Zyklon B turned hygiene into homicide, medicine into murder, progress into perversion. Its very existence reflected how ideology could corrupt every tool of civilization. In the chambers, the future of humanity was suffocated alongside its victims. By the time Zyklon B was fully adopted across extermination camps, its mechanics were well understood by those who wielded it. It worked quickly, reliably, and left perpetrators with minimal exposure to the sights and sounds of suffering. For this reason, it was chosen not only as a killing agent, but as the cornerstone of the final solution. The Nazis sought not merely to kill, but to do so in a way that could be hidden, rationalized, and perpetuated without hesitation. Zyklon B provided that answer, embedding science into genocide. The mechanics of death became predictable, repeatable, and scalable, like any other industrial process. But the gas chambers were not factories. They were graves built in advance, designed to erase millions. The legacy of Zyklon B remains a warning of how easily ordinary chemicals can be turned into weapons of atrocity. Its mechanics remind us not of technological triumph, but of the depths of human cruelty. The chemistry of life had been inverted into the chemistry of death. Auschwitz began as a modest camp in occupied Poland, originally designed to hold political prisoners. But by 1942, it had transformed into the beating heart of the Nazi extermination system. The expansion of Auschwitz-Birkenau, or Auschwitz II, was undertaken with brutal precision, fueled by Himmler's orders to create a killing facility on an unprecedented scale. Architects, engineers, and SS officers collaborated to design a space that could process, kill, and dispose of human beings with factory-like efficiency. The camp was divided into sections, each with its grim purpose: barracks for prisoners, rail sidings for incoming trains, and vast crematoria for the dead. Barbed wire fences stretched for miles, punctuated by guard towers that cast long shadows across the fields. The camp grew into a self-contained city of death, complete with workshops, warehouses, and storage depots for looted belongings. Unlike smaller camps, Auschwitz was not improvised but systematically constructed for mass killing. Every brick, every rail track, and every chamber served the logic of extermination. It was a place where human life was calculated, measured, and ultimately erased. The rail network feeding Auschwitz became its lifeline of destruction. Special trains, often marked as passenger services, brought Jews, Roma, and other targeted groups from across occupied Europe. Cattle cars crammed with men, women, and children arrived daily at the camp's infamous ramp, the Juden ramp. These transports represented the industrial scale of the genocide, each train carrying up to 2,000 souls. As the doors slid open, prisoners stumbled out, blinded by the sudden light, many already dead from suffocation or dehydration during the journey. SS doctors stood waiting, clipboard in hand, to conduct the selection process. A wave of the arm sent the majority, usually women, children, and the elderly, to the gas chambers. A smaller fraction, deemed fit for labor, were registered and sent into barracks, where survival was temporary at best. This system ensured that Auschwitz could simultaneously kill and exploit human beings. The railway tracks did not merely deliver victims, they fed the machinery of industrialized death. The construction of gas chambers at Auschwitz was both deliberate and expansive. Early experiments used adapted farmhouses, where Zyklon B pellets were poured through windows into sealed rooms. But these crude methods proved too limited for the scale the Nazis envisioned. Soon, purpose-built crematoria were designed, combining gas chambers with massive furnace systems. Each new facility could hold up to 2,000 people at once, sealed behind reinforced doors with rubber gaskets to prevent leakage. Ventilation systems were installed to clear the chambers quickly after mass killings, allowing a rapid turnover for the next transport. The crematoria contained underground undressing rooms, disguised as showers, where prisoners were ordered to leave their belongings neatly stacked. This deception prolonged hope until the very last moment. Above them the gas chambers awaited, engineered for maximum capacity. Architecture itself had been weaponized, designed not to shelter life, but to extinguish it. Zyklon B became the central instrument in this machinery of death. Delivered in airtight tins, it was stored in guarded depots before being issued for use in the chambers. SS men dropped the pellets through special vents, which dispersed the lethal gas within minutes. The underground design of the chambers helped contain the fumes, ensuring efficient exposure. Prisoners packed tightly inside succumbed in a grim choreography of suffocation, falling into heaps as the gas displaced breathable air. Sonderkommandos, Jewish prisoners forced to assist in the process, waited outside until the screaming ceased. Then, wearing gas masks, they entered the chambers to disentangle the corpses. Their work was harrowing, shaving heads, removing valuables, and dragging bodies to the crematoria furnaces. The gas chambers operated with terrifying regularity, often multiple times a day. Zyklon B, once a fumigant, had become the chemical foundation of genocide. The crematoria of Auschwitz were feats of engineering devoted to annihilation. Each furnace was designed to incinerate hundreds of bodies per day, with chimneys that spewed smoke over the surrounding countryside. When demand exceeded capacity, open-air pits were dug, where bodies were burned in great pyres fueled by wood and fat from the victims themselves. Engineers refined these methods constantly, seeking ways to increase speed and reduce cost. Ashes were shoveled into rivers, scattered across fields, or used as landfill, erasing physical traces of the dead. The efficiency horrified even some SS men, yet the system continued to expand. By late 1943, Auschwitz-Birkenau could kill and dispose of over 10,000 people daily. The crematoria stood not only as killing machines, but as monuments to the perversion of human ingenuity. In their shadow, the air itself seemed poisoned with death. The chimneys became silent witnesses to industrialized murder. The expansion of Auschwitz was not limited to buildings. It extended to systems of deception. To prevent panic, the Nazis perfected a script of lies, telling prisoners they were going for showers or disinfection. Signs in multiple languages reinforced the illusion, instructing victims to hang their clothes on hooks and remember the number. Orchestras, composed of camp inmates, played cheerful tunes as transports disembarked, masking the horror that awaited. Even the Red Cross was deceived on rare inspections, shown model barracks far from the killing sites. This web of falsehoods ensured that most victims entered the gas chambers without realizing their fate until it was too late. By then the doors were sealed and the machinery of death already in motion. Deception was as crucial to Auschwitz as bricks or Zyklon B. It turned hope itself into a weapon, exploited to maintain order during extermination. Lies became the prelude to silence. Auschwitz was not only a killing center, but also an economic hub of exploitation. The belongings of the murdered, clothes, shoes, suitcases, even hair, were collected, sorted, and shipped back to Germany. Gold teeth were pried from corpses, melted down, and deposited into Reich banks. Factories nearby used prisoner labor, extracting every ounce of productivity before death. The camp became a grotesque intersection of genocide and profit, where human beings were reduced to commodities. SS officers enriched themselves through corruption, siphoning valuables from the spoils. Entire warehouses, nicknamed Canada by prisoners, overflowed with stolen goods. For the Nazis, Auschwitz represented the ultimate fusion of ideology and economics, extermination paired with exploitation. Every object taken, every body burned, became part of a system calculated down to the smallest detail. In this way, Auschwitz was more than a camp. It was a machine that turned lives into ashes and wealth. By 1944, Auschwitz had reached its peak as the central stage of the Holocaust. The deportation of Hungarian Jews brought a surge of victims, with trains arriving day and night in relentless rhythm. At its height, the camp consumed entire communities within weeks, erasing them from the map of Europe. The scale was staggering, the pace unmatched by any other killing center. Auschwitz became a symbol of the final solution not only for its numbers but for its organization. It embodied the cold marriage of ideology, science, and logistics, all bent toward destruction. For the SS, it was proof of their control over life and death on an industrial scale. For the prisoners, it was hell incarnate, a place where survival was measured in hours. In Auschwitz, the machinery of genocide reached its most terrifying perfection. It was the central stage where humanity itself was put on trial and betrayed. While Auschwitz became the most infamous stage for Zyklon B, it was not the only camp where the chemical played its deadly role. The concentration and extermination camp of Majdanek, located near Lublin in occupied Poland, was another site where Zyklon B was deployed against prisoners. Originally established in 1941 as a forced labor camp for Soviet POWs and Polish civilians, Majdanek quickly evolved into a hybrid camp of imprisonment, labor, and mass killing. Unlike Auschwitz, Majdanek's gas chambers were smaller in scale, but no less lethal. Some were built of concrete, while others were improvised from existing structures, designed for rapid killings rather than mass extermination on an industrial level. Zyklon B was introduced here not long after its use in Auschwitz, marking a grim expansion of its function across the Nazi system. Prisoners were forced into chambers under the guise of disinfection, as in Auschwitz, with pellets poured into vents. The efficiency of Zyklon B made it attractive to camp authorities, who sought methods quicker than shootings or mobile gas vans. Majdanek thus became a laboratory of sorts, a secondary arena where Zyklon B showed its versatility as a tool of mass murder. Even in this comparatively smaller camp, tens of thousands of lives were extinguished under its blue crystals. Majdanek's use of Zyklon B revealed differences in design and scale compared to Auschwitz. Whereas Auschwitz relied on purpose-built crematoria with underground chambers, Majdanek's gas chambers were located above ground, connected directly to crematoria facilities. This configuration meant that bodies could be moved with less logistical complexity, but it also limited the number of victims that could be killed at once. Chamber sizes varied, with some rooms holding only a few dozen, while larger units could contain several hundred. Ventilation systems were rudimentary compared to those at Auschwitz, forcing longer wait times before prisoners could be removed. The crematoria at Majdanek were also less sophisticated, often breaking down under the strain of continuous use. When mechanical failures occurred, open-air pits were used to burn bodies, echoing methods at Auschwitz during its peak. The smaller capacity did not reduce the brutality, it merely altered its rhythm. The use of Zyklon B here demonstrated that the Nazi system tailored killing methods to each camp's infrastructure and local needs. The result was always the same: mass death delivered with chilling calculation. Beyond Majdanek, Zyklon B was introduced into other concentration camps, though its deployment was inconsistent. In camps such as Stuttgart near Danzig, Zyklon B was used in chambers primarily intended for disinfection, but also adapted for executions. Prisoners brought to Stuttgart could face shootings, hangings, or gassing, depending on circumstances and availability of resources. The camp's relative proximity to chemical supply depots made Zyklon B accessible, yet the smaller prisoner population limited its large-scale application. Similarly, at Neuengamme near Hamburg, Zyklon B was present but rarely deployed for mass killings. The camp primarily focused on forced labor, though executions by gassing did occur in controlled numbers. These variations highlight the flexible but uneven role Zyklon B played in the Nazi system. It was not universally adopted as the singular method of mass killing, but was integrated where logistics, infrastructure, and opportunity aligned. In each case, the gas became another instrument in the toolbox of destruction. Its use in multiple camps demonstrates how chemical extermination spread like a contagion across occupied Europe. However, Zyklon B was not the only chemical agent of mass killing. In camps such as Chelmno, Belsen, Sobibor, and Treblinka, the so-called Aktion-Reinhard camps, the Nazis relied on carbon monoxide gas rather than Zyklon B. Mobile gas vans at Chelmno pumped exhaust fumes into sealed compartments where victims suffocated in transit. Belsen, Sobibor, and Treblinka constructed stationary gas chambers using engines from captured Soviet tanks to generate lethal carbon monoxide. These methods were chosen in part due to availability and cost, since Zyklon B required industrial procurement through German chemical companies. Moreover, the Reinhard camps were designed for rapid extermination rather than labor exploitation, meaning their focus was on speed rather than reusability of facilities. These sites killed nearly 2 million Jews in a matter of months, demonstrating the adaptability of Nazi methods. The reliance on carbon monoxide rather than Zyklon B underscores the fragmented nature of the Holocaust's machinery. Killing methods varied, but the intention remained constant: mass annihilation of targeted populations. This variation reveals that Zyklon B was one weapon among many in the Nazi arsenal of genocide. The choice of killing method often reflected the camp's administrative structure and primary mission. Auschwitz and Majdanek, as hybrid camps combining labor and extermination, leaned heavily on Zyklon B because it could be delivered discreetly and efficiently while maintaining the illusion of showers. The Reinhard camps, by contrast, were strictly extermination centers, with no pretense of labor, and thus carbon monoxide was deemed more practical. Camps like Dachau, Buchenwald, and Mauthausen, meanwhile, experimented with Zyklon B but did not integrate it systematically. Their smaller-scale killings relied more on shootings, starvation, medical experiments, and beatings. This patchwork demonstrates that the Holocaust was not a monolithic system, but a network of overlapping techniques. The Central Command gave orders, but local administrators often improvised with the tools and chemicals available. In this improvisation, Zyklon B found its place as both a practical tool and a symbol of modernized killing. The varied adoption of Zyklon B reflects the uneven geography of the Holocaust. Death had many faces, and Zyklon B was one of its most recognizable. At Majdanek, evidence of Zyklon B's use was preserved in unusually direct ways. Unlike Auschwitz, where the SS destroyed gas chambers and crematoria during their retreat, Majdanek was captured largely intact by the advancing Soviet army in 1944. Investigators found gas chambers still lined with blue-stained walls, a chemical residue left behind by hydrogen cyanide. Empty Zyklon B canisters lay scattered in storerooms, providing undeniable proof of chemical extermination. The Soviets used this evidence in early war crimes reports, making Majdanek one of the first camps where Zyklon B's role was documented to the world. Survivors also testified to its use, recalling the false promises of disinfection followed by the horror of suffocation. The intact remains of Majdanek became a grim open-air museum almost immediately after liberation. Visitors could walk through chambers where Zyklon B had been poured only months before. In this way, Majdanek's Zyklon B chambers became among the most visible symbols of the Holocaust's chemical dimension. Unlike other camps, the evidence here was too immediate to deny. The spread of Zyklon B across multiple camps underscores the central role of industry in the Nazi project. Each canister originated from factories under the supervision of Degesch and IG Farben, companies that profited from state contracts, while ignoring or enabling the chemical's deadly repurposing. Distribution networks ensured that camps in occupied Poland and Germany could obtain supplies when needed. Records show invoices, shipments, and receipts, documenting how these companies sold Zyklon B in large quantities under the guise of pest control. In reality, the destination was often a killing chamber rather than a warehouse or farm. The economic bureaucracy behind Zyklon B normalized its presence in camps like Majdanek and Stuttgart. The cold language of paperwork disguised mass death behind coded terms. Industry's complicity meant that the Holocaust was not only an ideological project, but also a business venture. Zyklon B flowed along supply chains like any other commodity. It was murder delivered by invoice. By the war's end, Zyklon B had been deployed in at least 6 major camps and countless smaller facilities. Its role was most significant at Auschwitz and Majdanek, but its presence in other sites revealed a system that adapted chemical extermination as circumstances required. The fragmentation of methods. Zyklon B in some camps, carbon monoxide in others, did not diminish the overall scale of genocide. Instead, it demonstrated a chilling flexibility, a willingness to use whatever means were most efficient for mass killing. Zyklon B's story in these camps is not just about chemistry, but about the bureaucratic coldness that spread it like any other industrial product. From the steel canister to the chamber walls, it left a trail of evidence that spoke louder than words. Survivors carried memories of its smell, its suffocating silence, its finality. Historians later pieced together its distribution as part of the Holocaust's logistics. Zyklon B had become not merely a chemical, but a symbol of mechanized, organized annihilation. Its deployment across camps proved that the Nazi system was both coordinated and improvisational, united only by its devotion to death. Behind the walls of every concentration camp lay a supply chain that stretched back into Germany's boardrooms, factories, and warehouses. At the center of this chain stood IG Farben, one of the largest chemical conglomerates in the world during the 1930s and 1940s. Formed in 1925 through the merger of 6 major chemical companies, IG Farben controlled a vast empire of synthetic fuels, dyes, and pharmaceuticals. Its leadership aligned itself closely with the Nazi regime, seeing opportunity in rearmament and territorial conquest. Farben's executives became enthusiastic partners, financing the Nazi Party and profiting from its economic policies. When the Reich demanded chemicals for both civilian and military use, Farben supplied them without hesitation. Among these chemicals was Zyklon B, produced under subsidiaries like Degesch and Tester, and distributed to the camps. On paper it was still sold for pest control, but the volumes and destinations betrayed a darker purpose. The conglomerate's board members were not ignorant. They knew where their shipments were going. In this intersection of commerce and genocide, IG Farben epitomized the marriage of industry and ideology. Degesch, the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Schädlingsbekämpfung, functioned as the direct supplier of Zyklon B. Officially, it marketed the product for fumigating warehouses, ships, and clothing against lice and pests. However, by the late 1930s, its most lucrative contracts came from the SS, which purchased Zyklon B for delousing in camps. Distribution often ran through intermediary companies like Herdlinger, which helped mask the end use. Executives signed invoices and arranged transport, while pretending ignorance of what occurred at the final destination. Yet testimonies and surviving correspondence reveal that many were well aware. Some shipments were marked explicitly for Auschwitz, Majdanek, and Stutthof. Records indicate that sales volumes far exceeded what would have been necessary for genuine fumigation. The profits rolled in as the extermination machine accelerated. Degesch became both supplier and enabler, its role hidden in the banality of paperwork. IG Farben's complicity extended beyond Zyklon B. The company built and operated a synthetic rubber and fuel plant at Auschwitz, known as IG Auschwitz or Buna. This facility exploited tens of thousands of forced laborers from nearby concentration camps, many of whom died from exhaustion, starvation, and brutal conditions. Farben executives visited the site, fully aware of the human cost, yet continued production to support Germany's war effort. The proximity of Auschwitz-Birkenau meant that workers could be replaced as quickly as they perished. This industrial model of expendable labor complemented the extermination process carried out in the gas chambers. Zyklon B shipments flowed into Auschwitz, while IG Farben factories hummed beside them. The chemical industry and the killing industry thus operated side by side, each reinforcing the other. It was not only about supplying gas, but about embedding genocide into the fabric of industrial capitalism. Farben's reach transformed Auschwitz into both a death factory and a corporate enterprise. Other German companies also played crucial roles in sustaining the chemical supply lines. Tester, a manufacturer working under Degesch's patents, produced Zyklon B in large quantities. Shipping companies moved the sealed canisters across occupied territories, often accompanied by official paperwork describing them as fumigants. Smaller chemical firms, sometimes subcontracted, provided auxiliary materials such as prussic acid stabilizers and packaging. The supply chain thus extended far beyond IG Farben alone, implicating a web of industries. Many justified their actions as compliance with government orders, claiming they had no choice under the Nazi dictatorship. Yet this defense falters under scrutiny, for profit margins soared as production increased. The fact that companies competed for SS contracts demonstrates that complicity was not merely coerced, but sought after. Each link in the chain, from factory to transport depot, became part of the infrastructure of extermination. Murder, in this sense, was industrially outsourced and corporately managed. The complicity of chemical suppliers raises deep ethical questions that extend far beyond wartime Germany. Can a company claim innocence when its products are used for atrocities if its executives knowingly sign contracts with perpetrators? IG Farben's leaders later argued that they had little influence over how Zyklon B was used, hiding behind the idea of neutral commerce. Yet internal records, coupled with the testimony of survivors and Allied investigators, revealed otherwise. These companies did not simply supply chemicals in ignorance, they supplied them in knowledge of systematic mass murder. Profit was the silent partner of ideology. The decision to continue sales, even as reports of Auschwitz and Majdanek became widespread, speaks of calculated moral compromise. Industry became executioner, not by direct action, but by deliberate support. The Holocaust showed how genocide could be facilitated not only by bullets and soldiers, but also by balance sheets and quarterly profits. This was capitalism twisted into a weapon of annihilation. At the Nuremberg trials, IG Farben faced charges for its involvement in crimes against humanity. 24 executives were indicted in the IG Farben trial, a subsidiary proceeding after the main Nuremberg hearings. Prosecutors presented evidence of forced labor, industrial collaboration, and chemical supply to concentration camps. The defense argued that individual board members could not be held responsible for decisions made under state pressure. Ultimately, some executives were convicted, though many received relatively light sentences compared to the enormity of their crimes. Several returned to high-ranking positions in post-war German industry, a fact that shocked survivors and historians alike. The trial highlighted the limits of legal accountability for corporate complicity in genocide. Zyklon B shipments were discussed in court, but much of the responsibility was diffused through layers of bureaucracy. The verdict left an uneasy legacy, where justice seemed partial and incomplete. Corporate power, it seemed, could shield men as effectively as ideology. The story of IG Farben and Zyklon B compels us to think about the blurred lines between industrial innovation and mass destruction. A chemical invented to fight pests became the agent of human extermination when placed in the wrong hands. Factories, patents, and corporate structures that had once symbolized modern progress became machinery of death. Farben and its subsidiaries did not invent hatred, but they provided the tools that enabled hatred to industrialize. The Holocaust was not committed by ideology alone. It was executed with the cooperation of science, business, and commerce. This complicity was not abstract. It was concrete, measurable, and profitable. When companies compete for contracts to supply the means of murder, the question of coercion evaporates. Instead, we are left with a chilling portrait of willful partnership. Zyklon B was not produced in a vacuum, it was produced in a market, and that market thrived on the destruction of human life. Today, the history of IG Farben and its suppliers serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked corporate power. The ruins of IG Auschwitz remain a symbol of what happens when industry prioritizes profit over humanity. Museums and memorials document not only the suffering of victims, but also the roles of companies that fueled the machinery of genocide. The legacy continues to shape debates about corporate ethics, accountability, and responsibility in times of war. Can a company claim neutrality when it profits from mass death? Can technological innovation ever be separated from the uses to which it is put? The case of Zyklon B provides no comforting answers, only a stark reminder: in the Holocaust, corporations stood not at the periphery, but at the very center of annihilation. The gas chambers did not operate without supply lines, and those supply lines were manned by men in suits as much as men in uniforms. To remember Zyklon B is to remember that commerce too can kill. To understand the full horror of Zyklon B, one must step away from chemical formulas and industrial complicity, and hear the voices of those who endured its use. Survivors, though few, carried memories burned into their consciousness, recounting sights, sounds, and smells that language can barely contain. Prisoners in Auschwitz, Majdanek, and other camps were often forced into roles where they witnessed firsthand the mechanics of extermination. Many were part of the Sonderkommando, prisoners selected to work inside crematoria, handling the aftermath of mass gassings. These men were not perpetrators, but captives, forced under threat of their own deaths to manage a grotesque system. Their testimonies speak of screams that reverberated through thick concrete walls as Zyklon crystals hissed into life. Survivors recalled the silence that followed, a silence so heavy it felt unnatural, broken only by the scraping of keys as doors unlocked. Inside the chambers, the air was thick with a bitter almond odor and a suffocating stillness. The experience of witnessing such horror scarred them beyond words, yet their accounts remain among the most valuable records of Nazi atrocities. They give us the only human perspective on how Zyklon B transformed from inert pellets to a tool of mass murder. One of the most haunting testimonies came from Philip Müller, a Slovak Jew forced into the Sonderkommando at Auschwitz. He recalled in painstaking detail the process of leading victims into the chambers, watching them undress under the guise of disinfection. Mothers clutched their children, whispering words of comfort, while elderly men leaned heavily on canes, unaware of their final steps. Müller described the chilling deception: signs on walls indicating showers, hooks for clothes, and the reassuring voice of an SS guard telling prisoners to remember their number so they could reclaim their belongings. Once the heavy steel doors were sealed, Zyklon B pellets were poured through vents or openings in the ceiling. Within moments, the atmosphere shifted from uneasy anticipation to frantic panic. Müller remembered pounding on doors, scratching at walls, and the crescendo of thousands of voices rising in despair. The noise then died down in waves, replaced by silence, a silence he said could crush the soul of any man forced to hear it. His testimony brought to light not only the physical process of killing, but also the unbearable psychological torment of those condemned. For prisoners not in the Sonderkommando, knowledge of Zyklon B's role spread through whispers, fragments of rumor, and grim observation. Some prisoners saw columns of smoke rising constantly from crematoria chimneys, their ash settling on camp barracks and fields like grey snow. The smell of burning flesh permeated daily life, inescapable and unforgettable. Others overheard the screams from a distance, or watched as entire transports of thousands disappeared into buildings and never returned. Fear was constant, but so was the terrible clarity of understanding. Everyone knew what awaited them in those sealed structures. Prisoners lived in a twilight state, torn between denial and acknowledgement of the genocidal system surrounding them. Even if they avoided transport to the gas chambers, starvation, disease, and forced labor loomed close behind. The mere mention of Zyklon B became synonymous with death, a whispered code that carried despair through the barracks. Testimonies reveal that prisoners, despite their broken bodies, clung to fragments of knowledge as acts of mental resistance. Bearing witness became, for some, the only form of survival against oblivion. The Sonderkommando testimonies also describe the unbearable tasks assigned to them after gassings. Once the gas dissipated, they opened the doors to chambers filled with bodies stacked in grotesque tangles. Victims had clawed at walls, at each other, and at their own skin in desperate attempts to breathe. The dead were often found in huddled groups. Children pressed tightly against mothers, the elderly buried under layers of the younger and stronger, who tried to climb toward air vents. The prisoners were ordered to disentangle these masses, strip the corpses of valuables, and remove gold teeth for collection by the SS. Hair was shaved, rings were pried from fingers, and clothing was carted away for redistribution in the Reich. The task was carried out in mechanical silence, but each movement carried unbearable weight. Many Sonderkommando later said the hardest part was recognizing faces of neighbors, friends, or family among the dead. Yet they had no choice, for refusal meant joining the bodies they were ordered to burn. This testimony reveals the extreme dehumanization inflicted not only on victims, but on those forced to participate in their aftermath. Prisoners also remembered the sensory landscape of Zyklon B, the chilling details that cannot be captured in statistics or official records. They spoke of the metallic clang of the chamber doors locking, an unmistakable sound that sent shivers through even those outside. They described the hiss of pellets as they hit concrete floors, a faint sound but one forever associated with death. Survivors remembered the acrid smell of prussic acid that lingered long after, clinging to hair and clothing. The chambers once opened were heavy with humidity, condensation dripping from walls as the air cleared. The corpses bore a bluish discoloration, a physical marker of cyanide poisoning. Prisoners remembered the silence of the SS officers, efficient and detached, as though nothing unusual was happening. Each of these sensory details carved itself into memory, creating nightmares that would never fade. Survivors often said it was not the act of killing itself, but the atmosphere, the choreography of deception, sound, and smell that made the experience unbearable. Their testimonies reveal Zyklon B not only as a chemical, but as a lived horror. For many survivors, recounting their experiences was an act of courage, but also of excruciating pain. The memories did not simply return in words, they reawakened with each detail spoken aloud. Some survivors broke down while testifying in post-war trials, unable to finish their descriptions. Others spoke with chilling calm, their emotions numbed by years of silence. These accounts formed the backbone of Holocaust remembrance, ensuring that the lived horror of Zyklon B could not be denied or reduced to cold facts. Testimonies were not uniform. Each survivor had a unique perspective shaped by personal experience, position in camp hierarchies, and duration of survival. Yet all accounts converged on the same truth. Zyklon B was not an abstract weapon, but a lived experience of terror, deception, and death. Survivors spoke not to relive the trauma, but to honor those who never emerged from the chambers. Their words were acts of defiance against forgetting, testimonies of memory carved into history. Without these voices, Zyklon B would remain only a chemical, stripped of its human cost. Some testimonies highlighted the psychological torture of knowledge. Prisoners in the Sonderkommando were acutely aware that their time was limited. Every few months, the SS liquidated these units to eliminate witnesses. This knowledge gave their words urgency, for they knew survival was nearly impossible. A few risked everything to document their experiences, burying notes and diaries near crematoria, hoping future generations would uncover the truth. In some cases, scraps of paper written in trembling hands were found decades later, messages from the edge of human endurance, prisoners wrote of the unbearable weight of memory, describing themselves as living among the dead. They carried knowledge that could not be shared with others in the camp, a burden that isolated them even further. Survivor accounts reveal this knowledge as both a curse and a duty. Their lives were consumed by what they had witnessed, but it also compelled them to testify. The voice of the prisoner became, paradoxically, both the most fragile and the most enduring weapon against denial. These accounts ensured that Zyklon B's role in genocide could never be erased. The prisoner's perspective anchors the history of Zyklon B in the realm of human suffering. Without these voices, the gas would be reduced to numbers, shipments, and chemical equations. Survivors forced the world to see the Holocaust not as statistics, but as lived agony, filled with faces, cries, and silences. They bore witness not only to the crime, but to its psychological and spiritual dimensions, exposing how Zyklon B annihilated families, trust, and human dignity. Their testimonies transformed history into memory, ensuring that future generations could grasp the depth of what industrialized murder meant. To listen to them is to confront the unbearable weight of survival, the knowledge that they lived because others died. Each testimony is a thread in the fabric of remembrance, binding chemical science to human experience. In their voices, we hear the collision of ideology, industry, and cruelty made manifest in gas-filled chambers. And through their words, Zyklon B remains not merely a tool of genocide, but the symbol of humanity's capacity for both destruction and remembrance. Their voices ensure we cannot and must not ever look away. The adoption of Zyklon B marked a chilling turning point in the Nazi machinery of genocide. Before its introduction, mass killings relied on shooting squads and carbon monoxide gas chambers, methods that were effective but logistically cumbersome. Shooting required vast numbers of bullets, left behind forensic evidence, and inflicted psychological strain on the perpetrators themselves. Carbon monoxide gassing, used in the Atrocity 4 program, could only handle relatively small groups of victims at a time. By contrast, Zyklon B allowed thousands of people to be killed in a single day with far less preparation and fewer visible traces. The chemical arrived in sealed canisters, easily transported and stored, making it logistically efficient. When deployed in sealed chambers, a small quantity of pellets could asphyxiate hundreds in less than half an hour. No longer were mass killings limited by the capacity of firing squads or mobile gas vans. The shift to Zyklon B meant murder could be scaled to meet the ideological demands of genocide. In the calculus of Nazi efficiency, Zyklon B became the most cost-effective and systematized weapon of annihilation. The Nazis prided themselves on what they called efficiency, but this word concealed unimaginable cruelty. Zyklon B reduced the act of killing to a mechanical process that required minimal manpower. Instead of dozens of soldiers firing rifles into terrified crowds, a handful of SS men could open a hatch, pour in pellets, and wait. The physical and emotional distance this created allowed perpetrators to maintain a sense of detachment, stripping the act of killing of its immediate violence. This process blurred the boundary between industrial labor and murder, turning extermination into a routine task. Efficiency was measured not in terms of morality, but in body counts per hour, per chamber, per transport. Nazi records show that with Zyklon B, Auschwitz-Birkenau alone could kill and cremate more than 4,000 people per day. Each chamber became a conveyor belt of death, with prisoners ushered in, killed, and their remains processed in a chilling cycle. What had once required days of planning and hundreds of bullets could now be accomplished in mere minutes. Zyklon B thus mechanized genocide, embedding it within the Nazi obsession with order and productivity. The scale achieved with Zyklon B was not accidental but carefully engineered. The design of Auschwitz-Birkenau's gas chambers reflected architectural precision intended to maximize throughput. Large underground rooms were disguised as shower facilities, equipped with fake water pipes and drainage systems. Above them, small openings allowed SS guards to drop Zyklon pellets into the space without direct contact. The size of the chambers meant entire transports of 1,500 to 2,000 people could be killed simultaneously. Ventilation systems were installed to clear the toxic air quickly, allowing the Sonderkommando to enter within minutes and prepare the chamber for the next group. This created a cycle of extermination that could be repeated multiple times in a single day. The crematoria connected directly to these chambers further streamlined the process, ensuring bodies were disposed of with industrial regularity. Such integration of architecture, chemistry, and logistics illustrates the calculated nature of Nazi genocide. Zyklon B was not simply a killing tool, but a cornerstone of an entire system designed to eradicate human lives with chilling speed. Logistical efficiency was reinforced by the chemical's characteristics. Unlike gasoline for mobile vans or ammunition for firing squads, Zyklon B did not require constant resupply. A single canister could kill hundreds, and shipments were regular, discreet, and easily integrated into camp inventories. The chemical's pellet form ensured stability in transport and delayed release, making it manageable for those who used it. Camp administrators calculated quantities with cold precision, ordering enough to sustain continuous cycles of extermination without disruption. Even at the height of wartime shortages, Zyklon B remained available in abundance, proof of its priority within the Nazi system. This reliability gave the SS confidence to schedule mass transports from across Europe with ruthless punctuality. Each train arriving at Auschwitz or Majdanek was greeted with certainty that the killing mechanism was ready and waiting. Zyklon B thus made genocide predictable, steady, and scalable across months and years of operation. It was not merely a tool, it was the linchpin that made industrial extermination feasible. The efficiency of Zyklon B also lay in its ability to erase individuality. When entire transports were processed in minutes, the uniqueness of each human life disappeared into statistical tallies. Bureaucrats calculated extermination in tables, recording not names but numbers, not stories but quotas. This dehumanization aligned perfectly with Nazi ideology, which sought not to murder individuals but to erase entire peoples. Zyklon B became the chemical expression of this ideology, capable of swallowing thousands into silence with mechanical regularity. Prisoners recalled how entire families vanished in a single cycle, their lives extinguished before their absence could even be mourned. In this system, human beings became units of throughput, their existence reduced to the capacity of chambers and crematoria. The efficiency with which Zyklon B operated turned genocide into a process indistinguishable from industrial production. The SS measured results as if they were factory output detached from the moral gravity of their actions. Thus, the chemical's efficiency was not only physical but psychological, enabling genocide to proceed as though it were mere administrative routine. Efficiency also meant scalability beyond Auschwitz. At Majdanek, gas chambers adapted for Zyklon B expanded the camp's killing capacity, though on a smaller scale than Birkenau. In Stupthov, Sobibor, and other camps, the chemical was employed in varying forms, demonstrating its flexibility across different killing sites. Zyklon B shipments were distributed through established networks, ensuring that multiple camps could carry out extermination without interruption. Each camp developed procedures tailored to its facilities, but all shared the same chilling reliance on pellets of hydrogen cyanide. The adaptability of Zyklon B reinforced its central role in Nazi strategy, ensuring no bottlenecks slowed the genocidal campaign. Unlike methods that required specialized equipment or trained personnel, Zyklon B required only a sealed chamber and a guard with a canister. This simplicity made it possible to replicate mass killing across regions, extending the reach of the Holocaust. Scalability transformed genocide from localized acts of violence into a continental program of extermination. Zyklon B thus functioned not only as a weapon, but as a system-wide enabler of industrialized death. The efficiency of Zyklon B must also be understood in terms of time. In the Nazi worldview, speed was crucial. Faster extermination meant fewer resources spent on prisoners, less chance of rebellion, and quicker achievement of ideological goals. Shooting squads required hours, while carbon monoxide vans demanded logistical effort. Zyklon B condensed the timeline of death to mere minutes. Victims often perished within 15 to 20 minutes of exposure, and chambers could be cleared and reused within an hour. This speed allowed the Nazis to align extermination with transport schedules, ensuring trains arrived, unloaded, and were emptied with relentless rhythm. Efficiency in time translated to staggering totals, millions killed within a few short years. Survivors recalled how transports arrived daily, each one processed with ruthless precision, leaving no pause for reflection or delay. Zyklon B, by accelerating death, allowed genocide to keep pace with Nazi ambition. Time itself became weaponized, measured not in hours of life preserved, but in minutes to mass extinction. The chemical thus fulfilled the Nazi obsession with rapid, uncompromising destruction. In the end, Zyklon B's efficiency and scale redefined what genocide meant in the modern world. No longer confined to sporadic massacres or battlefield atrocities, mass murder became a planned industrial system. The chemical transformed extermination from improvised violence into a process that could be standardized, repeated, and expanded. Efficiency in killing meant predictability in death, allowing Nazi leaders to envision and nearly realize the destruction of entire populations. The scale it enabled was unprecedented. Entire nations of Jews, Romani, and others targeted for annihilation in a matter of years. This was not murder in the traditional sense, but extermination as an industrial project, rooted in chemistry, logistics, and bureaucracy. Zyklon B's efficiency blurred the line between science and atrocity, progress and destruction. It revealed how technology could be harnessed to serve ideology with devastating consequences. In its crystalline pellets lay the mechanism by which human beings were turned into numbers and erased from existence. This efficiency, so cold and clinical, became the ultimate enabler of the Holocaust's incomprehensible scale. Inside the walls of Auschwitz and other camps where Zyklon B was deployed, prisoners lived under a veil of terror, but also carried fragments of knowledge. Whispers circulated among inmates, pieced together from observations, rumors, and the testimonies of those who narrowly escaped the chambers. Prisoners noticed the arrival of Zyklon B canisters, often marked with innocuous labels, and began to suspect their deadly purpose. The Sonderkommando, forced to handle the aftermath of gassings, bore first-hand witness to its effects, their testimonies later becoming some of the most important records of Nazi crimes. Yet, for the majority of prisoners, knowledge remained partial, clouded by deliberate Nazi deception. Showers disguised as bathhouses, and the efficiency of the system kept many unaware until the final moments. Even so, within the camp underground, fragments of information were carefully preserved. Secret notes were buried in the ground or hidden in walls, describing the killing process with harrowing detail. These were desperate attempts to warn the outside world, though the authors often perished before their messages were found. In the shadows of despair, knowledge itself became a form of resistance. The Sonderkommando, though isolated and silenced by the SS, were central to documenting Zyklon B's use. These units of prisoners, compelled to work in the gas chambers and crematoria, carried an intimate knowledge of the process. They knew how Zyklon pellets were poured through roof openings, how victims suffocated, and how corpses were disposed of, risking certain death if caught. Some wrote diaries and testimonies on scraps of paper, later buried in canisters or jars near the crematoria. One such testimony, written by Zolman Gradowski, described in vivid detail the horror of mass killings, an attempt to ensure the world would one day know. The Nazis sought to annihilate both the victims and their memory, but these hidden documents defied that erasure. Such acts of recording were as courageous as armed uprisings, for they preserved the truth at the cost of life. The Sonderkommando revolts in 1944 were fueled partly by this knowledge, as men who had seen too much sought to resist even in their final hours. Their actions show how resistance took many forms, from written words to violent rebellion. Knowledge itself, smuggled and preserved, was a weapon against Nazi secrecy. Beyond the camps, resistance networks across occupied Europe sought to gather intelligence about the killings. Couriers carried reports from escapees who had fled Auschwitz and other extermination sites. The Polish underground, through the Home Army, and figures like Witold Pilecki, transmitted detailed accounts of mass extermination to the West. Pilecki himself volunteered to be imprisoned in Auschwitz, gathering evidence from within before escaping to deliver his report. His testimony described the systematic use of Zyklon B and the enormous scale of killings taking place. Other escapees, such as Rudolf Vrbier and Alfred Wetzler, brought harrowing details in 1944, producing what became known as the Vrbier-Wetzler Report. Their accounts included maps, statistics, and explanations of Zyklon B's role, challenging the world to act. Resistance networks risked everything to get this information to London, Washington, and the Vatican. Each courier faced the possibility of capture, torture, and death, but they carried the truth forward nonetheless. In this way, underground resistance extended beyond sabotage. It became the lifeline of knowledge about Zyklon B. The Allies received fragmented reports about Zyklon B from 1942 onward, but the magnitude was often underestimated or doubted. Early intelligence spoke of mass gassings, but the notion of extermination on such an industrial scale seemed inconceivable to many. British intelligence decrypted messages from the SS describing special treatment, but euphemistic language clouded the true meaning. Reports from the Polish government in exile and Jewish organizations repeatedly warned of gas chambers, yet official responses were muted. Many Allied leaders, focused on the war effort, treated these accounts as exaggerated or propaganda. This failure of imagination, or will, allowed the killings to continue largely unimpeded. Nonetheless, individuals within Allied governments did grasp the truth. By late 1942, the Allies had issued a declaration condemning the Nazi extermination campaign, though it lacked concrete measures. The knowledge was present, but action lagged behind, leaving the camps to continue their deadly work. In this tragic gap between awareness and response, Zyklon B continued to do its silent, devastating work. Within Jewish resistance circles, knowledge of Zyklon B's use shaped desperate attempts at survival. In ghettos like Warsaw, rumors of gas chambers fueled uprisings, as many chose to die fighting rather than be transported to their deaths. Smuggled messages from deportees confirmed what awaited those who boarded the trains. Resistance fighters thus saw rebellion not as a path to victory, but as a way to reclaim dignity in the face of mechanized murder. Some partisans in the forests intercepted transports, hoping to rescue a few from the inevitable fate in Zyklon-filled chambers. Inside Auschwitz itself, underground groups tried to spread awareness, though their ability to act was tightly constrained. Smuggling out fragments of Zyklon B canisters or testimonies became as much an act of resistance as armed attacks. Prisoners understood that the world needed to know the scale of the crime. By making knowledge itself a weapon, they fought against Nazi secrecy. The existence of these warnings stands as proof that silence was never total. Zyklon B's use was also known to ordinary Germans in ways that later trials would reveal. Workers in factories that produced the chemical often suspected or directly knew its ultimate purpose. Railway staff witnessed the endless transports to Auschwitz, many never returning. Locals near the camp saw smoke rise daily from crematoria, and rumors of mass gassing circulated widely. The sheer scale of Zyklon B deliveries, ordered in quantities far beyond normal fumigation needs, could not be easily hidden. Yet, fear of the regime and complicity in its ideology ensured that silence prevailed. This silence was not always ignorance, but often a choice to look away. The persistence of not knowing became part of the system, allowing Zyklon B to be deployed without mass protest. Still, pockets of German resistance, such as the White Rose Group, condemned the regime's atrocities in their leaflets. Though they lacked full details, their courage demonstrated that fragments of knowledge could spark moral outrage even within the Reich. International organizations also wrestled with knowledge of Zyklon B. The World Jewish Congress, the Vatican, and neutral governments like Switzerland received reports of gassings from multiple sources. Diplomatic channels carried appeals for intervention, often falling into bureaucratic inertia. The Vatican's silence remains one of history's most contested moral failures, as information about mass killings was known but not publicly condemned in strong terms. In the United States, Jewish groups pleaded for Allied bombing of the railways to Auschwitz, but military leaders argued resources were needed elsewhere. British officials debated publishing details of Zyklon B killings, fearing it would be dismissed as propaganda. In these debates, the urgency of genocide was often weighed against wartime strategy. The consequence was inaction. Even as knowledge deepened, resistance groups grew frustrated that their sacrifices in transmitting information seemed to fall on deaf ears. The history of Zyklon B thus reveals not only how knowledge was spread, but also how it was tragically ignored. Ultimately, the story of resistance and knowledge around Zyklon B is one of both courage and failure. Prisoners risked everything to document its horrors, embedding their testimonies in the soil of Auschwitz. Couriers carried fragments of truth across borders, building a picture of genocide piece by piece. Resistance fighters acted upon that knowledge, choosing defiance in the face of inevitable death. Allied governments received the information, yet hesitated to act with the urgency the situation demanded. Ordinary Germans often looked away, complicit in silence if not in action. And yet, despite these failures, the knowledge survived. The buried testimonies were unearthed after the war, the reports preserved in archives, the words of survivors carried across generations. Resistance ensured that Zyklon B's story could never be fully concealed. In the end, knowledge itself triumphed over Nazi secrecy, ensuring that the truth would outlive the perpetrators. As the Allied forces pushed into German-occupied territory in the final months of the war, few of the soldiers were prepared for what they would encounter. They had seen battlefields, bombed-out cities, and starving refugees, but nothing could compare to the reality of the concentration and extermination camps. When Soviet troops entered Majdanek in July 1944, It marked the first time the world would glimpse the machinery of death still intact. The soldiers found warehouses filled with clothing, personal belongings, and mountains of shoes, silent testimonies to the scale of loss. Gas chambers, some still bearing chemical stains on their walls, stood as haunting evidence of deliberate extermination. The discovery was so shocking that many at first could not believe what they saw, suspecting Nazi propaganda had been turned against its creators. Yet the overwhelming material evidence spoke louder than any denial. It became clear that these camps were not labor facilities alone, but carefully engineered death factories. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, liberated in January 1945 by the Red Army, the scale of the atrocity was even greater. Soldiers stumbled upon vast stockpiles of Zyklon B canisters, stacked in storerooms like ordinary supplies, each marked with company names that tied industrial production directly to genocide. Barracks designed for thousands were crammed with skeletal survivors, many too weak to stand, their eyes reflecting the unspeakable horrors they had endured. The crematoria, though partially destroyed by retreating Nazis, still emitted the stench of burnt human remains from recent killings. Surrounding the gas chambers were piles of human hair, sorted and packed into sacks for shipment, intended for industrial use. The very architecture of the camp revealed the cold logic of mass murder, with railway tracks leading straight into the heart of the killing complex. For the liberators, it was a scene that felt more like a descent into hell than the conclusion of a war. In camps like Dachau and Bergen-Belsen, liberated by American and British troops, the pattern repeated itself, though each site bore its own grim uniqueness. At Dachau, gas chambers disguised as shower facilities left no doubt about the method of killing. Zyklon B pellets were found in sealed tins, some unopened, confirming the lethal tools had been ready for continued use until the very end. British forces at Bergen-Belsen found heaps of unburied corpses scattered across the grounds, so numerous that bulldozers were required to manage them. Survivors were living skeletons, their bodies consumed by starvation and disease, yet they carried stories that filled the gaps left by material evidence. Each camp offered a devastating puzzle piece, and together they revealed the full scope of the Nazi system of annihilation. The Allies, who had entered with the goal of ending a war, realized they had also uncovered humanity's darkest crime. The evidence of Zyklon B's role was both immediate and undeniable. At Auschwitz alone, 7 tons of Zyklon B canisters were found after liberation, enough to kill millions of people. The walls of the gas chambers bore the corrosive blue-green stains of hydrogen cyanide, a chemical scar left by repeated use. These physical traces could not be erased, even though the Nazis had attempted to dismantle or blow up the crematoria to conceal their crimes. Soldiers collected the canisters, the labels, and the manufacturing codes, documenting the chain of supply that linked German industry to the final solution. Photographs taken by liberators captured rows of cans marked gift gas with skull and crossbones warnings, symbols of death that required no translation. In the moment of discovery, the canisters became more than industrial products. They were artifacts of murder, evidence destined for history and future justice. Liberators quickly realized that the evidence before them carried global significance. They began photographing, cataloging, and preserving the sites, often with the help of journalists who were brought in to bear witness. American newsreels showed the world the images of gaunt survivors, piles of bones, and the unmistakable symbols of mass murder. In Nuremberg, these visual records would later serve as irrefutable proof against Nazi leaders who attempted to deny knowledge of extermination policies. The chemical evidence of Zyklon B, tied to corporate suppliers, demonstrated that genocide was not the work of fringe fanatics alone, but had been facilitated by ordinary industries. What was uncovered in 1944-45 thus bridged the battlefield to the courtroom, transforming war into a confrontation with crimes that defied the boundaries of legality and morality. For the Allies, it was clear they were not only liberators, but also witnesses to history's gravest atrocity. For survivors, the moment of liberation was often bittersweet. Relief at the arrival of Allied forces was tempered by the weight of trauma, the knowledge of loved ones lost, and the sight of evidence confirming what they already knew too well. Many survivors testified about the distinctive smell and appearance of Zyklon B canisters, recalling the fear that spread whenever guards carried them toward the chambers. Their words added human context to the physical artifacts left behind. Where soldiers saw chemical stains, survivors described the screams of victims trapped inside. Where liberators found hair and shoes, survivors remembered the moments of arrival when families were stripped, separated, and led to their deaths. These testimonies transformed cold industrial evidence into a tapestry of lived horror, ensuring that Zyklon B would never be remembered as just a chemical, but as the instrument of suffering it became in Nazi hands. The discovery of Zyklon B canisters also shattered illusions about the scale of the genocide. Before liberation, the world had heard rumors of mass killings, but many dismissed them as wartime exaggeration or propaganda. Now the material evidence left no room for doubt. The industrial scale of the extermination process was revealed through logistics, rail timetables, warehouse inventories, and supply chains that moved poison gas alongside coal and steel. Each artifact told a story not only of death but of organization, planning, and chilling efficiency. The Allies understood that what they had uncovered was not a side effect of war, but a central aim of the Nazi regime. Zyklon B, stored in warehouses like any other commodity, symbolized the bureaucratic normalization of genocide, making murder a logistical task rather than a moral crime. The liberation of the camps thus marked both an end and a beginning. It ended the functioning of extermination centers, halting the daily use of Zyklon B as a tool of death. But it also began the process of confronting humanity with the scale of its own capacity for cruelty. The canisters, the chambers, and the testimonies became foundational evidence for trials, museums, and memorials. They were proof that could not be silenced, even in the face of denial or revisionism. The Allies' discovery of Zyklon B and its role in the camps transformed abstract reports into tangible reality, forcing the world to reckon with what had occurred behind barbed wire. Liberation was thus not only military victory, but also moral awakening, a moment when the true face of the Holocaust was laid bare before history. When the war ended in May 1945, the Allied powers faced the immense task of prosecuting those responsible for the most systematic campaign of mass murder in history. At Nuremberg, a tribunal was established to try Nazi leaders for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against peace. From the outset, Zyklon B was identified as a central piece of evidence, not just as a chemical but as the physical instrument that turned ideology into industrial slaughter. Prosecutors understood that to prove genocide on a global stage, they needed to demonstrate not only the intent but the means by which mass killing had been achieved. The canisters found in Auschwitz and Majdanek became courtroom exhibits, transformed from silent relics of atrocity into legal testimony. Their presence linked the abstract horror of millions dead with tangible objects jurors could see and touch. By putting Zyklon B at the heart of their case, prosecutors framed genocide not as rumor but as fact. It was this strategy that gave the trials a scientific rigor alongside their moral weight. The indictment of major Nazi leaders focused heavily on policy and command responsibility, but prosecutors soon turned their attention to the industrial partnerships that made the final solution possible. Companies like IG Farben, which had produced and distributed Zyklon B through subsidiaries, were placed under the spotlight. Courtroom records detail how invoices, contracts, and shipping documents were used to prove that corporate officials knew precisely how much gas was being delivered to camps, and in what quantities. The fact that Zyklon B required special licensing and came with technical instructions undermined any claim of ignorance. Lawyers presented evidence showing that suppliers had even added warning substances to the gas for civilian use, but deliberately omitted them for concentration camps, making detection impossible for victims. This distinction revealed premeditation and collaboration, exposing the blurred line between civilian commerce and state-sponsored genocide. At Nuremberg, the courtroom became not only a chamber of justice, but also a tribunal on the ethics of industry. One of the most striking trials was the so-called Zyklon B case, in which executives from the Hamburg firm Degesch and Stabenow faced direct charges. This company had been a key distributor of Zyklon B to the SS, delivering vast quantities that were funneled into Auschwitz and other extermination centers. The prosecution argued that executives could not claim ignorance of the gas's deadly purpose, as shipments far exceeded any reasonable need for pest control. Witnesses testified that company officials had attended SS briefings where the gas's role in mass killing was openly discussed. The defense attempted to argue that they were merely fulfilling orders, bound by law to cooperate with the state. But prosecutors countered that obedience did not absolve moral or legal responsibility. The courtroom drama thus pivoted on the question of complicity. Were these men simply businessmen, or were they facilitators of genocide? The verdict would echo across industries long after the trial ended. In presenting the case, prosecutors used both documents and survivor testimony to create an unbreakable chain of evidence. Photographs of gas chambers and crematoria were introduced, accompanied by expert analysis of chemical residues that confirmed Zyklon B's presence. Survivors described the fear that gripped barracks whenever guards appeared with canisters, their memories aligning with the physical objects displayed in court. Allied chemists explained in precise detail how hydrogen cyanide functioned and why its deliberate modification for human use could not be accidental. These explanations ensured that the court understood the distinction between legitimate disinfection practices and the criminal adaptation for extermination. The canisters themselves, stamped with the words "gift gas," provided the final irrefutable link between industrial supply chains and mass murder. In Nuremberg, science testimony and material artifacts fused into a narrative that exposed genocide not as chaos but as a calculated system. The defense, meanwhile, tried to shield industrialists behind the cloak of bureaucracy and coercion. Lawyers argued that their clients were merely fulfilling contracts under a dictatorship that left no room for refusal. They claimed that knowledge of the ultimate purpose of Zyklon B remained hidden within SS circles, beyond the reach of corporate distributors. But prosecutors dismantled these arguments by showing that distributors had supplied special training to SS officers in the handling of Zyklon B. They also pointed out that unusually large shipments to Auschwitz, far exceeding agricultural demand, could not have gone unnoticed by executives. Furthermore, some company representatives had even received commendations from the SS for their cooperation, undermining claims of unwilling participation. The court recognized that ignorance on such a scale was implausible, and complicity could not be excused by obedience. The defense's arguments crumbled against the weight of documented evidence. The outcome of the Zyklon B case carried profound symbolic and legal weight. Several executives from Degesch and Stabenow were convicted, with 2 sentenced to death and executed in 1946. These verdicts established a precedent that those who supply tools of mass murder bear responsibility equal to those who wield them. For the first time in history, chemical distributors were held accountable not as accessories, but as perpetrators of genocide. The judgment sent a message to industries worldwide. Neutrality was impossible when commerce became entwined with crimes against humanity. The trial also demonstrated the ability of international law to pierce corporate veils and hold individuals accountable for decisions made in boardrooms. In this sense, Zyklon B was not only evidence of genocide, but also the instrument by which justice was extended beyond the battlefield to the world of business. The Nuremberg trials also shaped global memory of Zyklon B as a symbol of mechanized evil. Courtroom proceedings were widely reported, with newspapers carrying images of the gas canisters and survivors' testimonies to audiences across the globe. For millions, Zyklon B became synonymous not with pest control but with death on an industrial scale. The trial transcripts entered into historical record, ensuring that future generations would not only know what had happened, but also how it had been proven in law. The symbolism of a corporate product becoming the centerpiece of a genocide trial blurred the boundaries between ordinary life and atrocity, showing how commerce could be weaponized against humanity. By turning Zyklon B into evidence, the trials ensured it would forever stand as a reminder of the dangers of dehumanization combined with technology. The courtroom thus redefined the gas, not as a chemical compound, but as a historical warning. In the end, the Nuremberg trials demonstrated that justice could reach even into the supply chains of genocide. Zyklon B, once a tool of extermination, became a tool of accountability, exposing the complicity of both individuals and institutions. The trials highlighted that genocide is never the work of a single figure, but the product of networks, political, military, and industrial, woven together to make killing possible. By prosecuting those who manufactured, distributed, and profited from poison gas, the Allies made clear that responsibility could not be deflected down the chain of command. In this way, the courtroom became both a place of reckoning and a stage for historical truth. The legacy of these trials extended beyond punishment, shaping international law and corporate ethics for decades to come. Zyklon B's presence in Nuremberg thus ensured that it would never be forgotten, not as a mere chemical, but as a symbol of justice rising from atrocity. In September 1945, only months after the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, the British convened one of the earliest war crimes tribunals in history. Known as the Belsen trials, these proceedings brought to justice dozens of SS guards, camp officials, and medical staff who had directly overseen mass suffering and death. Unlike the grand stage of Nuremberg, the Belsen trials were held in a modest courtroom in Lüneburg, Germany, yet their significance echoed worldwide. Among the accused were Joseph Kramer, the notorious Beast of Belsen, and Irma Grace, a young female guard whose cruelty shocked even hardened soldiers. The trial aimed not only to punish individuals, but also to expose the workings of the concentration camp system to the world. Witnesses included British soldiers, camp survivors, and even SS personnel, creating a mosaic of testimony. Zyklon B, as the weapon of extermination, once again took center stage as evidence. The court sought to unravel the chain of command, the orders given, and the hands that carried out death's daily routines. The testimony of survivors electrified the courtroom, offering unfiltered insight into how Zyklon B was used at Auschwitz, where many of the defendants had previously served. Prisoners described in chilling detail how SS guards escorted victims to gas chambers under the pretense of showers. They recalled the sound of canisters being opened and pellets poured through vents, unleashing a death cloud that consumed entire families within minutes. Witnesses spoke of guards standing by casually, even joking, while screams rose and then fell silent. These accounts shattered any notion that guards were passive functionaries. Instead, they revealed individuals who actively participated, knowing fully the horror of their tasks. The judges listened as survivors recounted the unbearable stench of burning bodies, the piles of corpses, and the systematic cruelty of camp life. Each word etched into the record the lived reality of genocide, countering any attempt at denial. Zyklon B in this context was no abstraction. It was remembered as an instrument of terror handled by human hands. The defense sought to argue that many of the accused had no choice but to obey orders. Lawyers painted the guards as small cogs in a vast machine, powerless to refuse the demands of their superiors. They insisted that Zyklon B deliveries were handled at higher levels, beyond the understanding of ordinary SS staff. But prosecutors methodically dismantled these claims by presenting documents, orders, and testimony showing that guards were not only aware, but often enthusiastic participants in the process. Witnesses described how certain guards carried canisters themselves, supervised killings, and mocked victims during their final moments. The very presence of guards at the gas chambers revealed a direct link between their duties and the mechanics of mass death. Prosecutors argued that blind obedience could not erase moral responsibility, particularly when the crime was so monumental. The Belsen trials became a pivotal moment in international law, a rejection of the defense of just following orders. Central to the prosecution's case was the role of Zyklon B as a deliberate and planned instrument of mass killing. Evidence included confiscated canisters, records of shipments, and testimonies of survivors who had witnessed their use. Chemists explained how the gas operated, underscoring that its adaptation for human extermination was intentional, not accidental. The court heard that Zyklon B pellets were supplied in quantities vastly exceeding any reasonable pest control use, especially in Auschwitz. Moreover, training sessions for SS personnel on how to deploy Zyklon B effectively were revealed, proving foreknowledge and preparation. These revelations tied guards and suppliers alike into a web of complicity. The trials showed that genocide required not only ideology, but also logistics, gas ordered, delivered, stored, and released by human hands. The methodical presentation of evidence transformed Zyklon B from a chemical product into a legal symbol of genocide, and its handlers into active perpetrators. Among the most infamous figures on trial was Irma Gracie, the youngest female defendant at only 22 years old. Survivors described her as sadistic, recounting beatings, whippings, and her presence during gassings at Auschwitz before her transfer to Bergen-Belsen. Her demeanor in court, a strange mix of youthful indifference and cold defiance, captured global headlines. Alongside her was Joseph Kramer, who had commanded both Auschwitz and Belsen, overseeing conditions that left thousands dead of starvation, disease, and poison gas. Their trials personalized the abstract horror of Zyklon B, attaching faces and names to the machinery of extermination. Both were found guilty and sentenced to death, their executions serving as stark symbols of justice. Yet the courtroom also exposed the uncomfortable reality that countless others who handled Zyklon B, guards, drivers, suppliers, would never face trial. Justice was partial, yet it marked an essential beginning. The Belsen trials also expanded beyond the SS to implicate civilian suppliers who provided Zyklon B to the camps. Evidence showed that companies like Degesch and Stabenow had delivered massive quantities of the gas directly to Auschwitz and other killing centers. Their executives, tried separately in Hamburg, were convicted of knowingly supplying poison for extermination. One was executed, while others faced long prison terms, reinforcing the principle that industrial complicity could not be excused as mere commerce. These verdicts echoed the earlier Nuremberg judgments, drawing a clear line: suppliers bore moral and legal responsibility when their products were used for genocide. For the first time in history, the private sector's role in mass atrocity was judged in open court. Zyklon B thus served as both evidence and indictment, pulling industry into the dock alongside the SS. The significance of the Belsen trials lay not only in the convictions, but also in the establishment of legal precedent. By prosecuting guards and suppliers, the court demonstrated that genocide is a crime with many hands, extending from high command to ordinary individuals. The rejection of the just following orders defense shaped international law for decades, influencing later tribunals from Rwanda to The Hague. Survivors, though haunted by their memories, found validation in seeing perpetrators confronted with their crimes. The proceedings also ensured that the horrors of Zyklon B would not fade into rumor, but remain anchored in legal testimony. This anchoring made denial harder, because the trials produced not only survivor voices, but judicial rulings backed by hard evidence. The Belsen trials thus carried significance far beyond Germany. They reshaped how the world thought about responsibility, obedience, and complicity in mass crimes. Yet even as justice was served, it was incomplete. Many lower-level guards escaped accountability, and numerous industrial figures avoided prosecution altogether. Still, the Belsen trials and their companion cases etched Zyklon B into history as both weapon and symbol. The sight of the canisters in court, the voices of survivors, and the executions of convicted perpetrators sent a message that echoed across nations. They reminded humanity that the killing of millions was not an act of nature, but a human enterprise involving countless decisions, signatures, shipments, and actions. Zyklon B embodied the terrifying ease with which science and commerce could be perverted into instruments of death. In making its handlers answer before the law, the trials offered a glimmer of justice to the dead and a warning to the living. The legacy of Belsen and beyond was clear. No one who carries out atrocity, however small their role, can hide forever behind orders or contracts. When the war ended, the voices of survivors emerged as the most powerful testimony against forgetting, and their words gave human shape to the otherwise clinical facts of Zyklon B. In diaries smuggled from ghettos, hastily scribbled notes, and whispered oral histories, survivors preserved memories of what it meant to live under the shadow of gas chambers. Their writings were often fragmented, interrupted by fear and secrecy, yet they carried an unmistakable urgency to leave behind a record if life itself was extinguished. The accounts described not only the act of killing, but the anticipation of death, the dread of hearing trucks roll in with Zyklon canisters, and the suffocating silence afterward. These testimonies, written in the immediacy of terror, often echoed the same haunting images: the blue-tinted pellets poured into openings, the sealed doors, the pounding fists of the dying. Each voice carried the weight of millions who could no longer speak, and in doing so, made Zyklon B not just a chemical, but a lived nightmare. Diaries became silent weapons of resistance, ensuring truth survived even where people did not. Oral histories collected after the war added further depth, as survivors were finally able to speak openly, often for the first time. Many recounted standing in lines, watching loved ones directed toward showers, and never returning. They described the moment when guards, sometimes laughing, opened canisters of Zyklon B and emptied their contents into chutes above the chambers. From outside they heard cries that rose in waves, then diminished into silence within minutes. Some spoke of the smell that followed, an acrid, sickly odor that clung to the air and to their memories forever. Others remembered the expressions on the faces of guards, cold indifference or even satisfaction as they waited for the process to end. These oral accounts were deeply personal, marked not by sweeping historical analysis, but by small details that only witnesses could capture. A shoe left outside a chamber, a child clutching a mother's dress, a final whispered prayer. Such images made Zyklon B's horror vivid and undeniable. Through these testimonies, survivors became the world's conscience. For some survivors, the experience of the gas chambers was not first-hand but transmitted through the words of Sonderkommando, prisoners forced to handle bodies after each gassing. Testimonies from these men became among the most haunting of all, since they bore witness to the mechanics of genocide from inside the chamber's shadow. They described opening doors after the gas had dissipated, only to find mountains of bodies piled against the walls, where victims had struggled in their final moments. Faces were contorted in expressions of agony, fingernails embedded in stone as people had clawed for breath. The stench was overwhelming, a mix of cyanide gas, sweat, and fear. Survivors who recorded these accounts often did so in smuggled writings or buried manuscripts, aware that their survival was unlikely. After the war, the fragments were uncovered, and the words of men long dead brought to life the grim detail of Zyklon B's effect. These voices, preserved against all odds, formed the most direct human testimony of industrialized murder. The act of remembering through testimony was not easy, and many survivors hesitated to revisit such trauma. Yet over time they came forward, compelled by a sense of duty to the dead. Courtrooms during the Belsen trials, and later memorial projects, provided platforms for these stories. Survivors described Zyklon B not only as a method of death, but as a weapon of psychological terror. Rumors of its use spread quickly among prisoners, creating an atmosphere of dread even before transports arrived. Testimonies revealed how fear of the gas shaped daily life. Every roll call, every separation, every selection carried the possibility of annihilation. This omnipresent fear made survival not only a matter of avoiding disease or starvation, but of existing under constant threat of the chamber. When survivors testified decades later, their words carried the rawness of memory that had never faded. Each account became a reminder that the trauma of Zyklon B lived on long after liberation. Diaries and post-war memoirs also emphasized the deception that surrounded Zyklon B's use. Survivors wrote of how victims were told they were going to be disinfected or showered, creating a false sense of security. Mothers reassured children, believing they were walking into something harmless, until the doors closed behind them. Survivors who worked near the gas chambers remembered the bitter irony of water pipes installed in ceilings, deliberately designed to mimic showers. Testimonies often carried a tone of betrayal, anger at the calculated cruelty of offering false hope in a place of death. The deceptive narrative was as much a weapon as the gas itself, stripping victims of dignity in their final moments. Survivors who bore witness to this cruel deceit described it in excruciating detail, ensuring that future generations understood that Zyklon B was not just about efficiency of killing, but about breaking humanity to its core. The testimonies revealed how lies paved the path to death. As decades passed, survivor testimonies became the backbone of Holocaust education and remembrance. Projects like the Scholke Foundation recorded thousands of oral histories, capturing survivors in their own voices. Within these vast archives, countless references to Zyklon B appeared, confirming its central role in the machinery of genocide. Survivors recalled not just events but emotions, fear, despair, helplessness, and the numbness of watching others die while being powerless to intervene. They spoke of nightmares that never left them, dreams where the sound of a falling pellet or the hiss of escaping gas brought back moments they had tried to bury. Many survivors confessed that their testimonies were acts of both burden and relief, painful to recall but essential to speak aloud. Through their words, Zyklon B remained present in collective memory, transformed from a chemical compound into a symbol of unimaginable cruelty. The diversity of survivor testimonies also underscored the widespread reach of Zyklon B across Europe. Accounts came not only from Auschwitz but from Majdanek, where the gas was also deployed, and from transit camps where prisoners feared its use even if they had not yet seen it. Survivors from different backgrounds, Jews, Roma, political prisoners, shared overlapping memories of fear, rumor, and reality. Despite differences in language or geography, the testimonies converged on the same haunting details: pellets falling, doors sealing, silence replacing screams. This convergence reinforced the truth of their accounts, weaving a web of consistency that withstood denial. The global spread of these voices after the war ensured that the memory of Zyklon B was not confined to one camp or one people, but became part of humanity's collective warning. Survivors carried these stories across oceans, ensuring no corner of the world could remain ignorant of the gas's legacy. In the end, survivor testimonies transformed Zyklon B from a scientific product into a moral symbol of the Holocaust. What chemical formulas and industrial records could not convey, human memory did: the terror of being herded toward a chamber, the suffocation of watching loved ones disappear, the crushing silence that followed. Survivors' words preserved not only facts but emotions, embedding history with feeling and humanity. Each diary entry, each recorded voice, each courtroom testimony became part of a chorus that resisted erasure. Their accounts gave Zyklon B a legacy beyond the laboratory or the courtroom. It became forever tied to memory, trauma, and the duty of remembrance. For survivors, testimony was not simply storytelling, it was an act of defiance against the killer's intention to erase their voices. Through them, Zyklon B would never be remembered as just a chemical, it would be remembered as a weapon of genocide, described by those who lived in its shadow. In the years following the Holocaust, as survivors and liberators tried to make sense of the enormity of what they had witnessed, a darker movement began to emerge, one that sought not to remember but to erase. Holocaust denial, often dressed in the language of skepticism, attempted to cast doubt on the overwhelming evidence of Zyklon B and the gas chambers. Deniers claimed that the canisters found at camps were merely for disinfection, ignoring testimony and documents that proved otherwise. They argued that cyanide traces in the walls of chambers were too low, deliberately misrepresenting scientific data to suit their agenda. Others suggested that survivors' memories were unreliable, or that Allied forces had fabricated photographs and reports. These distortions were not innocent mistakes, but calculated attempts to rewrite history. Their strategy was to plant seeds of doubt, however implausible, knowing that repetition could confuse future generations. Against this tide of falsehood, historians began a relentless battle to anchor truth in evidence. One of the earliest targets of denial was the Zyklon B itself, the chemical that had become synonymous with industrial murder. Deniers suggested that it was a pesticide with no role in human extermination, pointing to its pre-war use in delousing chambers. They highlighted the absence of towering piles of residue, deliberately misunderstanding the chemical's properties and dissipation. Some went further, claiming that gas chambers were simply showers or morgues that had been misinterpreted by Allied propagandists. The strategy was clear: recast evidence of atrocity as mundane, and thereby strip it of its horror. But survivors' testimonies, photographs, architectural blueprints, and German transport records stood as immovable counterpoints. The contradiction between denialist claims and the documented reality was vast, yet their persistence forced scholars to respond. Each denial statement became an opportunity for historians to reinforce evidence, turning falsehood into an opening for deeper truth. A critical battleground emerged in the analysis of cyanide traces within gas chamber walls. Deniers pointed to chemical studies showing lower levels than in delousing facilities, claiming this proved extermination never happened. What they ignored, however, was the very nature of gassing humans versus fumigating clothes, different conditions, exposure times, and chemical absorption. Historians and forensic scientists countered with rigorous investigations, explaining how porous surfaces, environmental factors, and shorter application times affected residue levels. They highlighted that execution gassings required only brief exposure to kill, unlike prolonged fumigation of clothing. Furthermore, samples from surviving chambers had been exposed to decades of weathering, reducing detectable traces. Court-appointed experts in multiple trials dismantled denialist misuse of chemistry, showing their arguments to be not scientific but rhetorical. This scientific engagement became essential, as it demonstrated that truth could withstand scrutiny. Each test reinforced the legitimacy of survivor accounts and archival records. Documents from the Nazi era provided another unshakable line of evidence. Deniers often tried to argue that there were no written orders for extermination, ignoring the deliberate secrecy of the Nazi state. Historians countered with transport records, procurement files, construction blueprints, and SS correspondence that outlined gas-tight doors, ventilation systems, and deliveries of Zyklon B far beyond sanitary needs. These documents showed both scale and intent, revealing how industrial systems supported mass murder. In one notorious case, invoices from Degesch, the company that supplied Zyklon B, demonstrated sales volumes inconsistent with mere disinfection. Combined with eyewitness testimony, these papers formed a web of corroboration that denial could not penetrate. Every archival discovery further dismantled the narrative of distortion. The attempt to erase history only made its traces more visible, as each denial provoked deeper archival exploration. The past, preserved in ink and paper, stood immune to distortion. Survivor testimony, though often attacked by deniers as unreliable, became one of the strongest tools against distortion. Historians emphasized that despite natural variations in memory, the consistency of accounts across camps, languages, and decades was undeniable. Thousands of survivors described the same processes of Zyklon B gassing, the trucks arriving, the pellets dropped, the screams, the silence. These memories were not inventions, but lived experiences, confirmed by forensic findings and Nazi records. Oral histories became a counterweight to denial, reminding audiences that facts were embodied in human lives. Each testimony carried a moral authority that no pseudoscience could undo. Survivors' courage in speaking, often at great personal pain, ensured that denial could not monopolize the narrative. The very act of remembrance became resistance, and in courts, classrooms, and memorials, their voices broke through the static of falsehood. Legal trials became pivotal in dismantling denial. Most famously, the cases of figures like David Irving, whose revisionist claims collapsed under courtroom scrutiny. Judges and expert witnesses laid out the evidence for Zyklon B's use in extermination, demonstrating how denial relied on selective quotations and deliberate misinterpretation. Courtrooms forced deniers to confront facts they could evade in print or speech. Cross-examinations revealed their lack of expertise, exposing ideological motives rather than scholarly inquiry. Forensic architects presented blueprints of chambers, showing reinforced walls, gas-tight doors, and ventilation systems built specifically for mass killing. Chemists explained the realities of cyanide traces, while historians traced shipments of Zyklon B to camps far beyond disinfection needs. Each trial became a public reaffirmation of truth. The law, though slow, proved an ally of history against distortion. The battle against denial also took place in classrooms, books, and eventually digital spaces. As deniers shifted to the internet, spreading doubt through forums and videos, historians adapted, publishing detailed rebuttals and engaging directly with younger audiences. Museums and memorials created exhibits on Zyklon B to explain the science and history behind its use. Teachers introduced primary documents into curricula, allowing students to engage directly with evidence rather than filtered accounts. Survivors themselves traveled to schools, giving testimony that confronted distortion with lived reality. The fight was no longer only academic, it became cultural, a struggle to ensure truth reached each new generation. Denial thrived in ignorance, but education turned knowledge into resistance. In this way, Zyklon B's story remained not just history, but a lesson against manipulation. Ultimately, denial and distortion revealed as much about the present as they did about the past. They showed how ideology could bend truth, how hate could cloak itself in the guise of skepticism. Yet the resilience of historical memory, anchored in science, documents, and testimony, withstood the assault. Zyklon B remained not a debated footnote, but an undeniable symbol of genocide. The efforts of survivors, historians, scientists, and educators ensured that distortion could never erase reality. Each denial attempt was met with deeper research, stronger evidence, and louder remembrance. In the end, denial failed not because it disappeared, but because truth outlasted it. The story of Zyklon B, distorted by some, was preserved by many, and in that preservation lay the ultimate victory, a memory that endures against all erasure. When the gates of Auschwitz were opened in January 1945, the liberators not only found the skeletal remains of survivors, but also the mute testimony of objects left behind. Among them were thousands of empty Zyklon B canisters, rusting in storage rooms, stacked in corners, and scattered near gas chambers. These metal tins, once sealed with deadly pellets, carried within them the residue of mass murder. Today, many of those canisters are preserved behind glass in museums and memorials across the world. They are not mere artifacts but material witnesses, silent proof of genocide. In Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, entire rooms are dedicated to them, their corroded lids and faded labels still legible with manufacturer stamps. Visitors walk past these canisters in silence, the weight of their presence crushing any attempt at words. Each tin is more than steel. It is a vessel of memory, binding the chemical precision of industrial killing to the human stories extinguished within. The preservation of Zyklon B canisters poses unique challenges for curators and conservators. Made from thin sheet metal and exposed to decades of moisture, many of the tins are fragile, their surfaces flaking with rust. Yet their deterioration is itself part of the history. They are aging witnesses, scarred by time but unwilling to disappear. Specialists at Auschwitz and Yad Vashem use controlled environments, low humidity and protective glass cases to slow the corrosion. Every decision about restoration carries ethical weight. Should these canisters be stabilized to look as they once did, or left to decay naturally as symbols of the passage of time? Museums often choose a middle path, ensuring they remain recognizable without erasing the scars of history. The careful work of preservation is not simply technical, it is an act of respect for the dead and a promise to the living that memory will not vanish. In Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, the canisters are displayed alongside survivor testimonies, photographs, and architectural plans of extermination sites. Here the Zyklon B tins are not presented in isolation, but within the larger narrative of Jewish suffering and resilience. The rusting steel sits behind glass, illuminated softly, almost reverently, as if to shield visitors from their brutal reality while still forcing recognition. Each dent and corroded edge tells of transport, storage, and use. Labels printed with chemical warnings in German, once ignored by perpetrators, now speak loudly to new generations. By placing these objects at the heart of remembrance, curators transform them into tools of education, showing visitors that denial is impossible when confronted with physical evidence. For many who enter Yad Vashem, the sight of these tins lingers longer than statistics or dates, because here history is tangible, unfiltered, and undeniable. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. takes a similar approach, placing Zyklon B canisters within a carefully curated timeline of Nazi persecution. They sit in vitrines alongside SS uniforms, deportation lists, and survivors' photographs, creating a juxtaposition between the machinery of murder and the humanity it extinguished. Visitors pass through the exhibits in hushed silence, often stopping longest at the canisters, recognizing their simplicity yet immense weight. Museum staff explain their original function as pest control, and then the twisted journey that transformed them into tools of genocide. This contextualization ensures that the tins are not fetishized as objects of horror alone, but understood as symbols of industrial complicity. Each visitor is confronted with the chilling reality that ordinary manufactured goods, mass-produced for civilian life, became the instruments of extraordinary destruction. The canisters preserved today are not only museum artifacts, but also legal evidence, frozen in time for posterity. Many of them were presented during the Nuremberg and subsequent trials, photographed, catalogued, and sealed as proof of the Nazi crimes. These same tins, decades later, remain accessible to researchers and historians who continue to study the material culture of genocide. Institutions safeguard them not only for remembrance but also for the possibility that they may again serve as counterweights to denial. Unlike words, which can be twisted, the metal containers hold an unyielding testimony. Their existence demands confrontation. They cannot be explained away, and they cannot be ignored. This permanence of evidence reinforces the role of museums as custodians of truth, ensuring that memory is not dependent on fragile human recollection alone, but anchored in physical reality. Visitors often describe the emotional impact of seeing Zyklon B canisters as more profound than reading survivor memoirs or watching documentaries. The sight of rusting tins piled together conveys the scale of the machinery of death in ways words cannot. School groups stand silent, tourists bow their heads, and survivors themselves often cannot bear to linger before them. Curators design these spaces with intentional austerity, allowing the objects to speak without distraction. There are no dramatic lights or theatrical music, only the cold reality of corroded steel. In these encounters, history is not distant or abstract, but immediate, overwhelming, and deeply personal. The artifacts become bridges between past and present, forcing each visitor to reckon with humanity's capacity for cruelty and the moral imperative of remembrance. Preservation extends beyond physical objects to digital archives, where Zyklon B canisters are photographed, scanned, and catalogued in high resolution. Institutions around the world have created online databases so that those who cannot travel to Auschwitz, Yad Vashem, or Washington can still bear witness. These digital reproductions, while lacking the raw presence of the original metal, democratize memory, making it accessible across borders and generations. Yet curators are clear: the originals must remain, for no digital image can replicate the aura of standing before the real thing. The tension between physical preservation and digital accessibility is part of the modern struggle to keep history alive in an age of distance and distraction. Every scan, every photograph is another safeguard against the erosion of memory, but the rusting tins themselves remain at the heart of remembrance. In the end, the Zyklon B canisters, preserved in museums and memorials, embody both death and survival. They are the instruments of atrocity, yet also the evidence that prevented denial from triumphing. They whisper of millions who could not speak, and they remind us of the survivors who bore witness, so these tins would not rest in silence. Their preservation is not merely about history, it is about humanity's confrontation with itself. By protecting these corroded fragments of steel, curators and historians ensure that each generation encounters the truth unfiltered, face to face. The canisters ask no questions and offer no comfort. They only exist as proof, and in their mute persistence lies their greatest power, a warning, an indictment, and an unending call to remember. The story of Zyklon B does not end with rusting canisters in museums. It endures as one of the darkest lessons in the intersection of science and morality. Here was a chemical designed to protect food supplies and human health from pests, transformed into an agent of mass extermination. Its history is a warning about the double-edged nature of scientific progress. Technology itself is neutral, but in the wrong hands it becomes a weapon of cruelty. Zyklon B is a case study in how ordinary products, stripped of ethical oversight, can be twisted toward extraordinary evil. This transformation underscores that genocide is not born from barbarism alone. It is facilitated by industrial systems, scientific expertise, and bureaucratic compliance. The canisters remind us that innovation without conscience can be catastrophic. In their corroded steel, humanity sees the reflection of its own potential for destruction, and in that reflection lies the first lesson. Science must never be divorced from ethics. Zyklon B has since become a symbol that transcends chemistry, representing the dangers of unchecked power and moral blindness in science. Unlike other weapons of war, it was not invented as a bomb or a gun, but as a tool of hygiene and agriculture. Its perversion illustrates how genocidal ideologies can infiltrate even the most mundane corners of daily life. This distortion carries a message that no invention, no matter how innocent its origins, is safe from abuse when ethics collapse. Today, historians and educators use Zyklon B to illustrate the fragility of moral boundaries in human affairs. It is invoked not simply as a chemical compound, but as a metaphor for the capacity of ordinary structures, industry, commerce, research, to become complicit in atrocity. To remember Zyklon B is to remember the thin line separating progress from peril. Its legacy warns us that responsibility must accompany every discovery, every contract, and every technological advance. The role of corporations in Zyklon B's history deepens the ethical implications. Companies such as Degesch and IG Farben did not act as fringe actors, but as pillars of German industry, profiting from contracts that supplied death. Their complicity exposes the dangers of placing profit above humanity, a lesson that echoes far beyond the 1940s. When business leaders signed delivery orders and calculated quotas, they turned genocide into a logistical problem rather than a moral crime. This transformation of murder into administration illustrates how ordinary commerce can enable extraordinary violence. In the decades since, economists, ethicists, and human rights advocates have studied Zyklon B as a warning about corporate accountability. The lesson endures. Industries are not neutral, and silence in the face of atrocity is itself complicity. To examine Zyklon B is to confront the uncomfortable truth that modern systems of business and science require vigilant moral guardianship. The symbolism of Zyklon B also extends to the role of individuals working within systems. Engineers, chemists, and managers knew what the gas was being used for, yet many justified their participation as obedience to orders or detachment from consequences. This disassociation between action and responsibility reveals how easily human beings can surrender conscience to authority. The lesson is chilling. Atrocity is rarely committed by monsters alone, but by ordinary people who convince themselves they are powerless or uninvolved. Zyklon B embodies this moral abdication, teaching that every individual decision contributes to the outcome of history. Today, educators emphasize this dimension when teaching about the Holocaust, not simply to recount crimes, but to demonstrate the responsibility each person bears within a larger system. In the cans of Zyklon B, one sees not only the power of chemicals, but also the collapse of personal accountability. That collapse is perhaps the most enduring warning of all. From a scientific perspective, Zyklon B also forces reflection on the ethical limits of research and technology. Science thrives on curiosity, innovation, and application. But history shows that discovery without ethical restraint can lead to devastating misuse. The Holocaust is a reminder that every scientific breakthrough carries a moral dimension. Discussions in bioethics, chemical warfare conventions, and international law often cite Zyklon B as a historical anchor. Its misuse provides the foundation for modern safeguards, such as the Geneva Protocol and chemical weapons bans. These protections are not abstract. They are born of blood, suffering, and lessons learned too late. The tins displayed in museums are thus more than relics. They are warnings codified into global agreements. The message is clear. The advancement of knowledge must always be balanced by humanity's responsibility to protect life. Without that balance, progress becomes peril. For survivors, the memory of Zyklon B is not abstract but deeply personal, shaping how they have spoken to the world about morality. In countless testimonies, they remind future generations that the gas did not simply kill, it silenced voices, erased families, and turned innovation into a weapon of erasure. Their stories transform Zyklon B from an object of chemistry into a moral lesson carved into human experience. Each testimony is a plea to prevent repetition, to ensure that no scientific discovery ever again becomes an accomplice to annihilation. Survivors insist that the world must learn not only from the brutality of perpetrators, but also from the indifference of bystanders. This insistence transforms Zyklon B into a mirror, asking each person to consider what they would have done. The lesson is uncomfortable, but it is necessary. Silence and passivity enable cruelty. The memory of Zyklon B teaches that humanity must not look away. Today, educators and memorial institutions emphasize the universal lessons of Zyklon B in classrooms, museums, and digital archives. Students are not simply taught chemical formulas or historical dates, but asked to reflect on ethics, responsibility, and human choice. Programs around the world use Zyklon B as a tool to discuss broader issues, medical ethics, environmental responsibility, and the power of technology in the modern world. The legacy of Zyklon B thus reaches far beyond the Holocaust, shaping debates about nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and genetic engineering. It teaches that every breakthrough carries the potential for both good and harm. In this way, Zyklon B remains one of the most haunting reminders that science cannot be separated from values. By framing these lessons in education, humanity attempts to transform an instrument of death into a guide for life. Ultimately, Zyklon B's legacy is one of stark contradiction, a pesticide turned into a symbol of genocide, a tool of death transformed into a teacher for humanity. Its corroded canisters preserved in museums and remembered in testimonies remind us that the past is never fully past. It lingers as warning, evidence, and moral compass. To study Zyklon B is to face uncomfortable truths about science, power, and human responsibility. It forces us to recognize that progress without ethics is peril, and obedience without conscience is complicity. The enduring lesson is clear. Knowledge alone is not enough. It must be guided by humanity. As long as these tins remain, humanity cannot claim ignorance. They stand as silent teachers, instructing each new generation that memory must be vigilance and remembrance must be responsibility. In their rust, the world is told, "Never again" is not a phrase, it is a duty.